Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the mists of time. Tonight, we invite you to drift into peaceful slumber as we explore one of humanity's most enduring mysteries, the story of the Great Flood. A tale whispered across every continent, echoed in every ancient culture, and etched into the collective memory of our species. As you settle into comfort, let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day dissolve. Tonight we travel back through millennia to examine not just a story, but a phenomenon that may have reshaped our world and the course of human civilization itself. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the sound of these words wash over you like gentle waves. We begin our journey now in the realm where myth meets memory, where legend touches truth, and where the ancient world whispers its secrets to those patient enough to listen. Part 1. Waters rising in the ancient mind. Imagine, if you will, a world before writing, before cities of stone and monuments that touch the sky, a world where stories passed from grandmother to grandchild, from elder to youth, around fires that pushed back the darkness. In this world, certain tales held such power, such importance, that they survived countless generations through spoken word alone. Among all these stories, one theme appears with startling consistency across the ancient world. The theme of waters rising, of floods that consumed the earth, of humanity brought to the brink of extinction, only to survive through providence, warning, or divine favour. This is not the story of one culture's myth. This is the story of a memory that seems woven into the very fabric of human consciousness, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the mountains of the Andes, from the islands of the Pacific to the forests of North America. Everywhere our ancestors gathered, they told variations of the same tale. Water rose, the world was consumed, humanity survived by the narrowest of margins. The question that has haunted scholars, scientists, and seekers of truth for centuries is simple yet profound. Why? Why does this story appear everywhere? Is it mere coincidence, a natural fear of floods projected onto cosmic scales? Or could these myths, separated by oceans and millennia, share a common root in actual events that shook the ancient world? Tonight, we explore these questions, not with the urgency of debate, but with the gentle curiosity of those seeking understanding. Let your mind wander through these ancient landscapes as we piece together fragments of a puzzle that spans the entire globe. The flood myths are, in many ways, humanity's first attempt at history. They represent our earliest efforts to explain catastrophic change, to make sense of a world that could transform beyond recognition. And within their poetic verses and legendary accounts may lie clues to real events that shaped our species. Breathe deeply, relax. Let us begin with the oldest written account we possess. Part 2. The Mesopotamian Waters. In the land between two rivers, in the cradle where civilization first bloomed, the oldest flood story we can read was written. Not in a time of peace, but preserved in clay, baked hard by fire and buried by time until archaeologists of the 19th century unearthed tablets that would rewrite our understanding of ancient literature. This is the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written in cuneiform script on clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, it tells of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, who sought immortality and found instead the story of the flood. Let your breathing match the slow rhythm of these ancient words as we recount the tale. Gilgamesh, mourning his friend Enkidu, journeys to find Utnapishtim, the only man granted eternal life by the gods. When Gilgamesh reaches this distant immortal, Utnapishtim reveals the secret of his gift. He survived the great deluge that the gods sent to destroy humanity. The gods, disturbed by the noise and chaos of humanity, decided to cleanse the earth with water. But Ea, the god of wisdom, warned Utnapishtim. He instructed him to build a boat, massive and sealed with pitch. A cube, some scholars suggest, roughly 200 feet on each side. Into this vessel, Utnapishtim was to bring his family, craftsmen of every trade, and the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim obeyed. He built the boat in secret, loading it with silver and gold, with all that he owned. On the appointed day he entered with his family and closed the door. Then the storm came. The epic describes it in words that still echo with power across the ages. The gods themselves were terrified by the flood they had unleashed. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged. Waters covered the mountains. all of humanity turned to clay. On the seventh day, the tempest calmed. Utnapishtim opened a hatch and saw only water stretching to the horizon. The boat came to rest on a mountain. He sent forth birds to find land. First a dove, which returned finding no place to rest. Then a swallow, which also returned. Finally a raven, which did not come back, for it had found dry ground. Utnapishtim then made offerings to the gods who, smelling the sweet savour, gathered like flies over the sacrifice. They had not realised how much they would miss humanity. Enlil, the god who had decreed the flood, was angry that anyone survived. But Ea argued that mankind should never be completely destroyed, and so Utnapishtim and his wife were granted immortality, removed from the world of mortals to live forever in a distant place. This story, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh in Assyria, predates the biblical account of Noah by many centuries. Yet the parallels are unmistakable. A righteous man, a divine warning, a boat built to specific dimensions, the loading of animals, the rising waters, the sending of birds, the mountain, the sacrifice, the survival. As you listen, your body grows, heavier, more relaxed. The ancient rhythms of this tale work their magic, as they have for thousands of years. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the only Mesopotamian flood account. Earlier still, from the Sumerian culture that preceded both Babylon and Assyria, comes the tale of Ziusudra. This story, fragmentary as it is, tells of a pious king who learned of the gods' decision to destroy humanity with a flood. He too built a boat and survived, eventually earning immortality and being placed in Dilmun, the land of the living. Another account, the Atrahasis epic, provides even more detail. Written around 1800 years before the Common Era, it describes a world where humans, created to serve the gods, multiply so greatly that their noise disturbs divine rest. The gods decide to reduce humanity through plague, drought and famine, but each time, humans survive and multiply again. Finally, Enlil decrees a flood to solve the problem permanently. But Enki, ever the friend of humanity, warns Atrahasis to build a boat. The description of the flood in this text is haunting. The storm god bellows in the clouds, the earth is broken like a pot. For 7 days and nights the deluge continues. When it ends, Atrahasis makes offerings, and the gods, realizing their mistake, establish new measures to control human population without total destruction. These stories from ancient Mesopotamia share common elements: divine displeasure with humanity, a chosen survivor, a boat as salvation, rising waters that consume the world, the survival of life through one family, the establishment of a new covenant between gods and humans. They also share a setting. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was prone to catastrophic flooding. These civilizations built their cities on river plains, dependent on the waters for irrigation and life, but vulnerable to their fury. Archaeological evidence shows multiple layers of flood sediment in ancient Mesopotamian sites. Life, destroyed by water, then rebuilt. This cycle repeated across centuries. Did a particular flood, more catastrophic than others, inspire these tales? Or do they represent the accumulated memory of many floods, compressed into a single mythic narrative? The answer remains elusive, lost in the same waters that inspired the stories. Let your mind drift now, like a boat on calm waters. We move from Mesopotamia westward to a story that would become the most famous flood account in the world. Part 3. The Biblical Deluge. In the book of Genesis, 6th chapter, we encounter the most widely known version of the flood story. The account of Noah and the Ark has shaped Western culture, religion and imagination for over 2,000 years. Let us examine this tale not with judgment, but with the same curiosity we bring to all ancient narratives. The text tells us that God looked upon the earth and saw that humanity had become wicked. Every inclination of the human heart was toward evil, continuously. God regretted creating humans and decided to wipe them from the earth, but one man found favour in divine eyes. Noah was righteous, blameless among his generation. He walked with God, and so God warned him of the coming destruction. The instructions were specific and detailed. Build an ark of gopher wood, rooms within, sealed with pitch inside and out. The dimensions: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Roughly 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. a structure of immense proportion for its time. Make a roof, leaving an 18-inch opening around the top for light and air. Build 3 decks. Make a door in the side. Noah was 600 years old when he began this task, the text tells us. For decades, according to tradition, he laboured at this construction while the world watched and mocked, building a boat far from any ocean, preparing for a flood that had never been seen. God commanded Noah to bring into the ark 2 of every kind of creature, male and female, to keep them alive. Later passages suggest 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. Food for all these creatures was to be stored within. Then came the day of entering. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons Shem, Ham and Japheth, and their wives. 8 human souls total. The animals came as commanded, and God sealed them inside. The text describes the flood with a geophysical precision unusual for ancient literature. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. The windows of heaven opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. Waters rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains. Everything with breath in its nostrils died. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. Then God remembered Noah. A wind passed over the earth, and the waters began to recede. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah waited. 40 days after the peaks became visible, he opened the window and released a raven, which flew back and forth until the waters dried. Then he sent a dove, which returned finding no rest. 7 days later he sent the dove again. It returned with a fresh olive leaf in its beak. 7 days more and the dove did not return. Noah removed the covering of the ark and saw that the ground was dry. But God had not yet given permission to leave. Only after the earth had fully dried, more than a year after entering the ark, did God command them to emerge. Noah's first act was to build an altar and offer burnt offerings. The scent pleased God, who made a covenant never to destroy all life with a flood again. The rainbow was given as a sign of this promise, a covenant with every living creature for all generations. The story is powerful in its simplicity. Judgment and mercy intertwined, destruction and preservation as 2 sides of divine action, the flood as both ending and beginning. The old world washed away, a new one emerging from the waters. But what is especially intriguing is how this account, written down perhaps 2,500 years ago, shares so many specific details with the Mesopotamian tales that preceded it. The notion of divine regret over creation, the choice of one righteous man, the boat built to precise specifications, the catastrophic flood, the mountain landing, the birds sent out to test for dry land, the sacrifice afterward, the divine promise. Scholars have long debated the relationship between these accounts. Did the Hebrew writers borrow from Mesopotamian sources? Did both traditions draw from an even older common ancestor? Or did they independently preserve memories of the same actual events? The biblical account differs in crucial ways from its Mesopotamian counterparts. In Genesis, there is one God, not a pantheon of squabbling deities. The flood is a moral judgment, not the result of divine annoyance at human noise. Noah's survival comes through righteousness, not through the whim of one sympathetic God. The covenant afterward establishes a permanent promise, not temporary population controls. These differences reveal evolving theological understanding, but the core narrative remains remarkably consistent. Water, boat, family, animals, mountain, bird, covenant, new beginning. Your breathing has slowed. Your body sinks deeper into rest. The rhythm of these ancient words works like a lullaby, as indeed they have for countless generations who heard these stories before sleep. Beyond the biblical account, Jewish tradition preserves many additional details about the flood in texts like the Book of Enoch and various midrashic commentaries. These describe the wickedness that brought on the flood in greater detail, telling of fallen angels who mated with human women, producing giants called Nephilim. They describe the chaos inside the ark, Noah struggling to feed all the animals with their different needs and schedules. They tell of the raven's reluctance to leave the ark and Noah's frustration with the bird's hesitation. These elaborations show how a story grows in the retelling, how each generation adds its understanding and imagination to ancient narratives. But beneath all the additions and interpretations, the core flood story persists, unchanged in its essential elements. From the biblical tradition, the flood story spread throughout Christianity and Islam, becoming foundational to multiple faiths. The Quran recounts the story of Noah in several surahs, with variations that reflect Islamic theology. In this telling, Noah preached to his people for 950 years, warning them to turn from wickedness. Only a handful believed. When the flood came, it destroyed the unbelievers, including one of Noah's own sons who refused to board the ark. The Islamic account emphasizes Noah as a prophet and warner, a theme that runs throughout the Quran. The ark is a sign of God's mercy and justice combined. The flood demonstrates that God gives ample warning before judgment, but that rejection of truth carries inevitable consequences. Across 3 major world religions, the story of Noah's flood has shaped moral teaching, theological understanding, and cultural imagination. But these are not the only traditions that remember a great deluge. Let us journey now to other lands, other peoples, other memories of water rising. Part 4. Greek Waters and Mediterranean Memories. The ancient Greeks, whose culture would profoundly influence Western civilization, also preserved flood traditions. But unlike the single, world-ending deluge of Mesopotamian and biblical tradition, Greek myths speak of multiple floods across different ages of the world. The most famous Greek flood story centres on Deucalion and Pyrrha. Let your mind travel to ancient Thessaly as we recount this tale. Zeus, king of the gods, looked upon humanity during the Bronze Age and saw great wickedness. To test their depravity, he disguised himself as a traveller and visited the court of King Lycaon. The king, suspicious and cruel, served Zeus a meal made from human flesh. Enraged at this abomination, Zeus destroyed Lycaon's house with lightning and transformed the king into a wolf. But Zeus's anger at humanity did not end there. He decided to destroy the entire Bronze Age race with a great flood. He called upon his brother Poseidon, god of the sea, to raise the waters. Rain fell from the sky. Rivers burst their banks. The sea rose and consumed the land. Mountains disappeared beneath the waves. Humans and animals alike perished in the deluge. But one man, Deucalion, son of the Titan Prometheus, had been warned by his father. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, foresaw the flood and instructed his son to build a chest, a large wooden box. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha entered this chest with supplies of food and water. For 9 days and 9 nights they floated on the endless waters. On the 10th day the rain ceased. The chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus, the only peak still visible above the flood, or in some versions Mount Othrys or Mount Etna. The mountain varies in the retelling, but the pattern remains consistent. When the waters receded, Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged to find themselves alone in a drowned world. They descended to find an oracle, seeking guidance on how to restore humanity. The oracle spoke in riddles, as oracles do. It told them to veil their heads and throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. Deucalion puzzled over this strange command. Then understanding dawned. Their mother was Gaia, the earth herself. Her bones were the stones of the ground. They veiled their heads in piety and walked forward, casting stones behind them as they went. Where Deucalion's stones landed, men sprang up. Where Pyrrha's stones landed, women arose. Thus humanity was reborn from the earth itself, harder and more resilient than before. Deucalion and Pyrrha also had children of their own, including a son named Hellen, who became the ancestor of all Hellenic peoples. This Greek flood story shares the essential pattern: divine judgment on human wickedness, warning given to one righteous man, a vessel that saves, floating on endless waters, landing on a mountain, emergence into an empty world, restoration of humanity. But notice the differences too. The vessel is a chest, not a vast ark. Only 2 humans survive. No animals are specifically mentioned as saved. The flood lasts days, not months, and humanity is restored not just through Deucalion's descendants, but through stones transformed into people, suggesting a new creation rather than mere preservation. Greek tradition also remembers other floods. Agai's was said to have survived an earlier deluge that struck Boeotia. This flood occurred so long ago that it marked the beginning of reckoning time in Greek chronology. Anything before Ogygian times was considered lost in the mists of prehistory. Plato, in his dialogues, mentions floods as recurring catastrophes that periodically destroy civilizations, particularly coastal ones. In the Timaeus, an Egyptian priest tells Solon that the Greeks are like children, with no memory of the deep past, because floods regularly wipe away their records and force them to begin again. The priest suggests that Egypt, protected by the Nile and lacking heavy rains, preserves memories that other cultures have lost. This is a fascinating idea, that catastrophic floods might explain why ancient peoples seem to have no memory of earlier civilizations, that the archaeological gaps we find might represent not gradual decline but sudden, water-driven destruction that severed the chain of memory. The Greeks were not alone among Mediterranean peoples in remembering floods. The Phrygians spoke of a great flood from which only a man named Nanicus and his people survived on Mount Dindymus. The Armenians had their version, with the ark landing on their mountains. The Syrians preserved flood traditions that mixed with Mesopotamian accounts through cultural contact and conquest. Around the Mediterranean, from Iberia to Anatolia, from North Africa to the islands of the sea, traces of flood memory appear in myth and legend. Waters rising, civilizations drowning, survivors clinging to mountains or boats. The pattern repeats with endless variation. Were these separate events, each culture remembering its own local catastrophe, or echoes of the same event distorted through time and retelling? The Mediterranean itself offers clues. This sea, relatively calm and enclosed, has nonetheless experienced dramatic changes in level throughout history. Geological evidence shows periods when its waters rose or fell by significant amounts, drowning coastal settlements or exposing new land. The Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow gap between Europe and Africa, has been closed and opened by geological forces multiple times in deep history. When closed, the Mediterranean can evaporate down to a fraction of its current size. When the strait opens, the Atlantic rushes in with unimaginable force. This is called the Zanclean Flood, and it occurred over 5 million years ago, long before humans. But other events, more recent, might have created real floods within human memory. The end of the last ice age saw sea levels rise dramatically as glaciers melted. This was not a sudden event in human terms, but rather a process unfolding over millennia. Yet in certain places, at certain times, the sea could rise catastrophically, drowning coastal plains and valleys in geological instants, which is to say within decades or centuries. For humans living on those coasts, such changes would be apocalyptic. Your grandfather's grandfather might remember the sea a mile further out. The valley now drowned, still dry and green. Stories of such drownings would be passed down, gaining mythic power with each generation. But let us move now from the Mediterranean to an even older culture, to a land where floods were both blessing and curse, life and death intertwined with the rhythm of waters. Part 5. Egyptian waters and the absence of flood myths. The Nile River defined Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. Every summer the river rose, flooding the fields, depositing rich silt that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. This annual inundation was so regular, so predictable, that Egyptians built their calendar and agricultural cycle around it. Yet curiously, Egypt preserves no great flood myth. No story of waters rising to destroy the world. No ark riding out a deluge. This absence is itself instructive and worthy of contemplation as you relax into deeper rest. The Egyptian creation myths speak of the primordial waters of Nun, the chaos that existed before creation. From these waters the first land emerged, like the mounds that appeared when the Nile's flood receded. But this is creation, not destruction. The waters of Nun are the source from which the world comes, not the force that destroys it. Some scholars suggest this absence of flood mythology reflects Egypt's unique relationship with water. The Nile's flooding was beneficial, expected, celebrated. It brought life, not death. Unlike the Tigris and Euphrates, which could flood unpredictably and destructively, the Nile rose on schedule, blessed the land, and retreated. Egyptians had little reason to fear water or imagine it as divine punishment. However, Egyptian texts do preserve memories of chaos and destruction taking other forms. The Book of the Dead speaks of the world returning to the waters of Nun at the end of time, when only Atum and Osiris will remain. This is not a historical memory but an eschatological vision, a description of the end times. More intriguingly, the tale of the destruction of mankind tells of humanity's near extermination. In this myth, Ra, the sun god, grows old and humans begin to mock and disrespect him. Enraged, Ra sends his daughter Sekhmet in the form of a lioness to punish humanity. Sekhmet goes into a killing frenzy, slaughtering humans by the thousands, bathing in their blood. Ra realizes the destruction has gone too far. To stop Sekhmet's rampage, he creates beer mixed with red dye to look like blood. 7,000 jars of this crimson beer are poured out, flooding the fields. Sekhmet drinks the beer thinking it's blood, becomes intoxicated and falls asleep, forgetting her mission of destruction. Humanity is saved. This myth involves flooding of a sort, but benevolent flooding that prevents destruction rather than causing it. It's almost an inversion of the Mesopotamian pattern. Yet the core idea remains: divine wrath nearly destroys humanity, but intervention saves a remnant. The absence of Egyptian flood myths might also support the theory that flood stories preserve actual memories. If the great floods that created Mesopotamian myths never significantly affected Egypt, then Egyptians would have no such memories to preserve. Their civilization, isolated by desert and sustained by a predictable river, developed differently. But Egypt gives us something else valuable in understanding ancient floods. In Plato's Timaeus, as mentioned earlier, an Egyptian priest claims that Egyptian records are older and more complete than Greek ones because Egypt is spared the periodic catastrophes, especially floods, that destroy other civilizations. The priest tells Solon, "There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story that even you Greeks have preserved, that once upon a time Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt." Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. The priest continues, explaining that when gods purge the earth with water, those dwelling in mountains and high places survive, but when fire is the agent of destruction, those near rivers and the sea are preserved. Egypt, he claims, is protected from these extremes by its unique geography and the Nile's reliable nature. Then the priest tells Solon about Atlantis, which brings us to one of history's most enduring mysteries. But we shall return to Atlantis later. For now, let us note what Egyptian wisdom suggests: that floods are recurring events that destroy civilizations and their memories, that different regions experience different catastrophes, and that some places preserve knowledge lost elsewhere. Your breathing is deep and regular now. Your body has found its natural rhythm of rest. We journey onward through the world's flood stories, each one a variation on the theme of waters rising. Part 6. The Floods of Asia. Across the vastness of Asia, separated by immense distances and diverse cultures, flood myths appear with remarkable consistency. Let us travel now to the Indian subcontinent, then eastward to China, exploring how these great civilizations remembered the deluge. In Hindu tradition, the story of Manu and the great fish appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana, a text over 2,000 years old, though the oral traditions it preserves are certainly older. This tale has the gentle, dreamlike quality that suits our evening journey. Manu, the first man and the father of humanity, was washing his hands in a river when a small fish swam to him and begged for protection. The fish warned that a great flood was coming and promised to save Manu if he would help the fish grow large enough to survive the deluge. Manu agreed. He placed the fish in a jar. When it outgrew the jar, he moved it to a larger vessel. When it outgrew that, he moved it to a pond, then to a river. Finally, the fish grew so large that only the ocean could contain it. When Manu released the fish into the sea, it revealed its true identity. It was Matsya, an avatar of the god Vishnu. Matsya instructed Manu to build a great boat and gather the 7 sages, along with seeds of every plant and pairs of every animal. When the flood came, Matsya reappeared as an enormous horned fish. Manu tied the boat to the fish's horn with a serpent used as rope, and Matsya towed them through the raging waters, rising above mountains through endless rain and churning seas. For years they sailed through the flood, Matsya pulling them across the waters. Finally the fish brought them to the highest peak still visible above the waters, Mount Himavan, the peak of the Himalayas. There Manu waited for the waters to recede. When they did, he was alone, the only survivor. From Manu alone, through his prayers and sacrifices, humanity was reborn. Later versions of the story, found in the Mahabharata and the Puranas, add more details. The flood is sent to end one age of the world and begin another. Manu saves not just living things, but also the Vedas, the holy texts, preserving knowledge across the catastrophe. The fish god pulls the boat not just to save Manu, but to ensure the continuity of Dharma, the cosmic order. This Indian flood story shares the familiar pattern: warning from a divine source, a chosen righteous man, a boat built for salvation, the gathering of animals and seeds, rising waters that cover even mountains, survival on a peak, the preservation and restoration of the world. But notice the unique elements: the fish as saviour and guide, the towing of the boat rather than mere floating, the focus on preserving knowledge and cosmic order, not just biological life, the flood as transitional event between ages, not purely as punishment. Hindu cosmology sees time as cyclical. Ages, called yugas, rise and fall. At the end of each great age, the world is destroyed and remade. Floods are one mechanism of this cosmic recycling. The story of Manu's flood appears in this context, marking the transition between one era of creation and another. Moving eastward, we come to China, where flood myths take a different form but remain central to cultural origin stories. The Great Flood of Gunyu is fundamental to Chinese civilization mythology. Unlike the sudden divine judgment of Middle Eastern floods, the Chinese flood was a prolonged catastrophe, requiring years of heroic human effort to overcome. In primordial times, the Yellow River and other waters rose and would not recede. The flood covered the land, disrupting the harmony between heaven and earth. People fled to mountains, but even there they could not farm or live properly. The sage Emperor Yao faced this crisis and appointed Gun to control the waters. Gun laboured for 9 years, building dams and dikes to contain the flood, but the waters always broke through or rose higher. Gun's approach of containment failed. Eventually he was punished for his failure, either executed or exiled, dying in disgrace. But Gun's son Yu took up the work. Yu realised that his father's method had been wrong. Rather than trying to hold back the waters with barriers, Yu decided to channel them, creating paths for the water to flow safely to the sea. For 13 years Yu laboured. He dredged rivers, carved channels through mountains, directed streams into proper courses. He was so devoted to this work that he passed by his own home 3 times without stopping to visit his wife and child. Finally Yu succeeded. The floodwaters receded, flowing through the channels he had created. The land was restored. People could return to their fields. For this achievement, Yu was made emperor, founding the Xia dynasty, traditionally considered China's first dynasty. The story of Yu's flood is fascinating because it's less purely mythological than many flood tales. It contains practical hydraulic engineering principles, the idea that water must be channeled rather than merely blocked. It emphasises human effort and ingenuity over divine intervention. The flood is not a moral judgment, but a natural disaster requiring technical solution. Some scholars suggest this myth preserves memory of actual extensive flooding in ancient China, perhaps caused by the bursting of natural dams in the Yellow River system. Others see it as an origin myth for the Chinese state, with flood control representing the organising principle of government, the reason civilization needs rulers and coordinated effort. Another Chinese flood tradition appears in the myth of Nua, the goddess who created humanity. In this story, the pillars holding up the sky were broken in a battle between gods, causing the heavens to tilt and waters to flood the earth. Nua responded by smelting stones of 5 colours to patch the holes in the sky, cutting the legs off a giant turtle to create new pillars and using reed ashes to stop the floodwaters. This story explains not just floods, but cosmic disorder requiring divine intervention to restore balance. Further east, Japanese mythology includes the tale of the storm god Susanoo, causing great destruction with floods and tempests. Though Japan's island geography and frequent actual tsunamis give its water catastrophe, stories a different flavour from continental flood myths. In Southeast Asia, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam and Malaysia preserve numerous flood traditions. The Ifugao people of Luzon tell of the great flood caused by 2 gods fighting. A brother and sister survived by floating in a single dwelling. the Batak people of Sumatra tell of a flood that covered the earth, with survivors in a boat landing on a mountain after 40 days. The Thai tradition speaks of floods that destroyed earlier worlds, with each age of humanity ending in catastrophe and renewal. The pattern repeats across the region, though often mixed with later Hindu and Buddhist influences. What is striking about Asian flood myths is their sheer diversity combined with underlying similarity. The scale of Asia, the isolation of its many cultures before modern times, makes the presence of flood traditions across such vast distances particularly intriguing. These stories developed independently, yet share the core elements we've seen elsewhere. As your mind drifts through these Asian landscapes, envision the mighty rivers, the monsoon rains, the mountains rising from mist. These were lands where water was always a force to be reckoned with, where the line between blessing and curse could shift with the seasons. Let us continue our journey, moving now to lands where different peoples encountered the same watery memory. Part 7. The Americas and their deluge traditions. The indigenous peoples of the Americas developed rich and complex civilizations in complete isolation from the Old World for thousands of years. Yet when European explorers and missionaries arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were astonished to discover that these peoples too preserved flood traditions, stories of great deluges that had destroyed earlier worlds. Let your mind travel now across the Pacific, to the vast continents of North and South America, where hundreds of distinct cultures each carried their own version of the flood story. Among the Aztecs of central Mexico, the legend of the 5 suns describes the creation and destruction of multiple worlds. Each sun, each age, ended in catastrophe. The first sun was destroyed by jaguars that devoured humanity. The second sun ended when the world was destroyed by hurricanes. The third sun was consumed by rains of fire. But it was the fourth sun that concerns us, tonight. The fourth sun was called Nahuatl, meaning 4 water. This age ended when the heavens collapsed and the world was flooded. The waters rose for 52 years. Humanity was transformed into fish. Only 1 man and 1 woman survived by hiding in a hollow log, or, in some versions, by climbing a cypress tree that remained above the waters. These 2 survivors, Nata and Nena, repopulated the earth, but they disobeyed divine instructions not to make fire and roast fish. The smoke from their fire displeased the gods, who transformed the survivors into dogs. Humanity in the current age, the 5th sun, descended from different origins. Yet the memory of the water world remained central to Aztec cosmology. The Maya, whose civilization flourished for thousands of years across Mesoamerica, preserved similar traditions in the Popol Vuh, their sacred book of creation. This text describes how the gods attempted multiple times to create humanity, destroying each imperfect version before beginning anew. The first humans were made of mud, but they were too soft and dissolved. The second were carved from wood, but they lacked souls and proper worship. These wooden people were destroyed by a great flood sent by the heart of sky. The waters came, along with attacks from animals and even their own possessions turning against them. Only a few survived, fleeing to the trees, becoming the monkeys that inhabit the forests. Finally, the gods created true humans from maize, and these are the ancestors of the Maya people. But the flood that destroyed the wooden people remained a pivotal moment in creation history. Moving north, among the indigenous peoples of North America, flood stories appear with remarkable frequency. The Ojibwe people tell of the great flood sent to cleanse the earth when humans became wicked and forgot the proper way of living. Nanabojo, a spirit being and teacher, survived the flood by climbing a mountain, then recreating the earth with the help of animals. In this story, Nanabojo sent various animals diving down through the floodwaters to bring up earth from beneath. The beaver tried and failed. The otter tried and drowned. Finally, the muskrat dove deep and succeeded, bringing up a paw full of mud, though dying in the effort. Nanabojo placed this earth on the back of a turtle, and it grew to become the land. This is why North America is called Turtle Island in Ojibwe tradition. The pattern here differs from Old World flood myths. The flood is cleansing rather than merely punitive. Animals play active roles in restoration rather than being passive passengers. The earth itself must be recreated, not simply drained and dried. The turtle bearing the world on its back becomes a foundational image in indigenous cosmology. The Lakota people preserve the story of a great flood that covered even the highest peaks. Only Crow, flying with a woman on his back, survived by flying continuously until the waters receded. They landed on a mountain, and from this pair humanity was restored. The Cree tell of Wissakedjak, their trickster culture hero, who survived the flood and recreated the world with the help of animals diving for Earth, similar to the Ojibwe account. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest tell of a flood that forced people to seek refuge on mountaintops. Those who survived became ancestors of different tribes. The Hopi describe multiple previous worlds, each destroyed when humanity became corrupt. One world ended in ice, another in fire, but the third world was destroyed by water. The fourth world, our current world, was reached by climbing up from the flooded third world through a hollow reed that reached from water to sky. What is remarkable is not just that flood stories exist among Native American peoples, but their sheer number and distribution. From the Arctic to Patagonia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, flood traditions appear among peoples who had no contact with each other, who spoke unrelated languages, who developed distinct cultures. Researchers in the 19th and early 20th centuries documented over 300 separate flood traditions among indigenous American peoples. While some of these may have been influenced by Christian missionary activity after European contact, many were clearly indigenous and ancient, preserved in oral traditions that predated any European influence. The Inuit people of the Arctic tell of a time when the earth tilted and the sea rushed over the land. Survivors fled to the mountain tops with their kayaks, waiting for the waters to recede. The flood came suddenly, with little warning, drowning many. Among the Inca of Peru, legends tell of a great flood that destroyed the world before the rise of Inca civilization. The creator god Viracocha sent the flood to punish humanity for their wickedness. Only a few people survived on the highest mountain peaks, where they waited out the deluge before descending to repopulate the valleys. The Araucanian people of Chile preserve a detailed flood tradition. They tell of a contest between two serpents, one good and one evil. Their battle caused earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, which in turn brought catastrophic flooding. Some people saved themselves by climbing to the tops of high mountains called thegtheg, which had the power to float on water. Brazilian tribes told early European visitors about a great flood from which only 3 men survived by climbing a mountain. When the waters receded, they descended and found the world empty. To restore humanity, they threw fruit over their shoulders. The fruit transformed into men and women repopulating the earth. The consistency of these flood traditions across the Americas presents a fascinating puzzle. The Americas were populated by humans at least 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, through migrations across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia. Did these migrants bring flood stories with them, memories of catastrophes in the Old World? Or did floods in the Americas itself create these traditions? The end of the last ice age affected the Americas dramatically. Immense ice dams held back vast lakes of glacial meltwater. When these dams failed, the resulting floods were truly catastrophic. The Missoula floods, for instance, carved the scablands of Washington state, moving more water than all the rivers of the earth combined. These floods occurred multiple times between 15 and 13,000 years ago, exactly when humans were spreading through the Americas. Such catastrophic floods would have been apocalyptic to any humans in their path. Entire landscapes transformed overnight, lakes appearing where none existed, valleys scoured clean. The memory of such events could easily be preserved in oral tradition, gaining mythic significance with each retelling. The Americas also experienced dramatic sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Coastal peoples would have watched the ocean encroach year by year, generation by generation, drowning familiar landscapes. The Bering Land Bridge itself was flooded around 10,000 years ago, cutting off Asia from America. Such ongoing, visible catastrophe would imprint itself on cultural memory. But there may be an even simpler explanation. Floods are real, recurring natural disasters. Every culture that lives near water experiences them. The universality of flood myths may reflect the universality of floods themselves, each culture preserving its own local memories while the essential story, being based on common human experience, remains similar. As you sink deeper into relaxation, consider this. The flood stories of the Americas, developed in complete isolation from the Old World, converge on the same essential narrative. Waters rise, The world is destroyed, a few survive, life begins again. The pattern holds even across the vastness of oceanic separation. Let us journey now to another isolated region, the islands of the Pacific, where seafaring peoples who navigated by stars also preserved memories of the deluge. Part 8. Islands and the Memory of Waters. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly a third of the Earth's surface, dotted with thousands of islands where Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian peoples developed sophisticated maritime cultures. These were peoples whose lives were defined by water, who navigated thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, who read the stars and the waves with intimate knowledge. Yet even among these master seafarers, or perhaps especially among them, flood traditions appear. In Hawaiian tradition, the story of the flood is preserved in ancient chants and legends. The waters rose to cover all but the highest peaks of the islands. Some stories tell of a great rain that lasted for many days. Others speak of the ocean itself rising. A few survivors took refuge on the summit of Mauna Kea, the highest point in Hawaii, waiting for the waters to recede. One version tells of Nuu, a Hawaiian Noah figure who was warned by the god Cain to build a great canoe. Nuu followed the instructions, bringing his family aboard. The flood came, lifting the canoe above the highest mountains. After a time, the waters receded, and the canoe came to rest on a mountaintop. Nuu planted offerings and celebrated his survival. The parallels to the Noah story led early Christian missionaries to assume this was a corrupted version of the biblical account, spread by early Pacific voyagers who had somehow learned the Genesis story. But the Hawaiian tradition appears genuinely ancient, preserved in pre-contact oral histories that show no signs of Middle Eastern influence. In Tahiti, legend tells of a flood that covered the island in ancient times. The god Ruahatu caused the waters to rise, destroying most of humanity. Only a man and his wife, warned by the god Tain, were saved. They took refuge in a canoe along with a pig, a dog, and chickens. When the flood ended, they landed and began to repopulate the island. The Maori people of New Zealand preserve the story of Tauhaki, a great hero and ancestor who lived during a time when the world was afflicted by floods. Some versions describe a single great deluge. Others speak of repeated floods that forced the people to higher ground. The floods were sent by the gods as punishment for human transgressions, but also as a means of renewing the world. In Fiji, flood traditions tell of Dege, the supreme god, who sent floods to punish humanity but preserved two chiefs who showed him respect. These chiefs survived by floating in a large canoe until the waters subsided. Across Polynesia, from Samoa to Tonga to Rapa Nui, flood stories appear with local variations but common themes: islands submerged, ancestors fleeing to mountaintops, canoes riding out the deluge, the ocean rising above the land. For island peoples, the fear of flood was immediate and visceral. A rise in sea level threatens not just coastal areas but entire islands. Storms can generate waves that sweep across low atolls, killing everyone. Tsunamis can devastate shorelines within minutes. The Pacific Ring of Fire, with its frequent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, creates tsunamis regularly. The Polynesians' flood traditions may preserve memories of actual tsunamis that destroyed communities. They may remember the gradual rise of sea level at the end of the Ice Age, which would have been particularly noticeable on small islands. Or they may reflect the constant awareness that their entire world, their island, could be consumed by the ocean that surrounds it. But the consistency of flood myths across the Pacific raises questions about their origin. The Polynesian peoples spread across the Pacific relatively recently in historical terms, beginning their great migration from Southeast Asia perhaps 3,000 years ago. They carried with them language, culture, and stories. Did they carry flood myths from their Asian homeland, adapting them to their new island environments? Or did the universal human experience of floods, combined with the particular vulnerability of island life, spontaneously generate similar stories among peoples separated by vast ocean distances? In Micronesia, the people of the Caroline Islands tell of a great flood that came because humans became too wicked. The sea rose and covered the islands. Only those who climbed to the highest point survived. When the waters receded, the survivors descended and found their world transformed. In Melanesia, the peoples of Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu preserve complex flood traditions mixed with volcano myths. The earth itself can erupt, and tsunamis can be generated by undersea earthquakes or landslides. These peoples live in one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, where catastrophe is an ever-present possibility. Among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, flood stories appear throughout the continent despite its generally arid climate. The Kurnai people of southeastern Australia tell of a time when the sea rose and flooded the land, forcing people to flee to the mountains. The flood came as punishment for violating sacred laws. In northern Australia, Aboriginal traditions speak of a time when the sea level was much lower, when areas now underwater were dry land where people hunted and gathered. These traditions may preserve actual memories of the post-Ice Age sea level rise which flooded the Sal continental shelf, transforming Australia's coastline and creating the Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea. The Ngurindjeri people of South Australia have detailed oral histories describing the gradual drowning of coastal lands, stories that correlate remarkably well with geological evidence of sea level rise thousands of years ago. These are not mythological flood stories, but historical accounts passed down through generations, describing real landscape changes witnessed by ancestors. This suggests something profound, that oral traditions can preserve accurate information across thousands of years, that what we call myths may sometimes be history, distorted by time but rooted in actual events, that ancient peoples had long memories and the ability to pass crucial information across countless generations. Your breathing is deep and slow now. The rhythm of these island stories lulls you like the sound of distant waves. We move now from specific cultural traditions to examine what archaeology and geology tell us about ancient floods. What evidence exists beyond myth and legend? Part 9. Archaeological Whispers of Water. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they often find unexpected evidence. Layers of sediment interrupting occupation levels, signs of sudden abandonment, deposits that speak of water where water should not be. Let us examine some of the most intriguing archaeological evidence related to ancient floods. In southern Mesopotamia, excavations at ancient Sumerian cities have revealed multiple flood layers. At Ur, the famous city of Abraham, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s and discovered a layer of clean clay and sand, 8 feet thick, separating earlier prehistoric remains from later Sumerian civilization. Woolley believed he had found evidence of Noah's flood. This sterile layer, containing no artifacts or organic material, suggested a massive flood that had buried the earlier settlement. Similar layers were found at other Mesopotamian sites like Uruk, Kish and Shurapak. However, further investigation revealed complications. The flood layers at different sites did not correspond to the same time period. Some were older, some younger. They appeared to represent different floods occurring at different times across the region. No single catastrophic flood layer marked all Mesopotamian sites simultaneously. This suggests that the Mesopotamian flood myths may be composite memories of multiple devastating floods, rather than one single event. The Tigris and Euphrates Valley has experienced major floods throughout history. Any one of these could have seemed world-ending to those who experienced it, especially if it destroyed their city and killed most of their people. The myths take these local catastrophes and universalize them, transforming historical floods into cosmic events. This is what myth does, scaling personal and communal trauma to archetypal proportions. In the Black Sea region, an intriguing discovery has sparked debate about a possible flood event preserved in cultural memory. In the 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. According to this theory, around 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was a much smaller freshwater lake, lying well below global sea level. The Bosphorus Strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean was dry land, a natural dam holding back the salt water. Then, as glaciers continued melting and sea levels rose, the Mediterranean finally breached this natural barrier. Seawater poured through the Bosphorus in a massive cascade, possibly flowing at 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. Within a short time, geologically speaking, the Black Sea filled to its current level, its shores advancing rapidly, drowning vast areas of coastal lowland. If humans were living around the shores of the pre-flood Black Sea, and archaeological evidence suggests they were, this event would have been catastrophic. People would have watched the sea advance day by day, drowning their settlements, their fields, their world. Within perhaps 2 years, the shoreline moved inland by miles, unstoppable, incomprehensible. Survivors would have fled, carrying with them memories of the deluge. These peoples, displaced from the Black Sea shores, may have migrated outward, spreading into Anatolia, Mesopotamia and Europe, bringing their flood stories with them. Could this be a source for the Near Eastern flood traditions? The hypothesis is controversial. Some geological evidence supports it. Other evidence suggests the flooding may have been more gradual. Underwater archaeology in the Black Sea has found submerged ancient coastlines, but whether they were drowned suddenly or slowly remains debated. What is not debated is that the Black Sea did flood and expand dramatically in prehistory. The question is whether this happened fast enough and recently enough to be preserved in human cultural memory. Moving to the Mediterranean, evidence exists for numerous coastal settlements drowned by rising seas after the Ice Age. The island of Malta, for instance, has underwater temples and structures suggesting that coastal areas now submerged were once occupied. Throughout the Mediterranean, submerged settlements from 7,000 to 10,000 years ago hint at populations displaced by rising waters. In the Persian Gulf, recent research suggests the entire Gulf was dry land at the end of the Ice Age, with the Tigris and Euphrates joining to flow through what is now the seabed. Archaeological sites from this period would now lie underwater. As sea levels rose, this fertile valley was gradually flooded, forcing populations to relocate to the surrounding highlands to Mesopotamia proper. Some researchers speculate this drowned valley might have been the biblical Eden, the lost paradise from which humanity was expelled, not by divine decree but by rising seas. The flood of the Persian Gulf would have taken centuries, but to peoples living through it, the relentless advance of the ocean would have seemed like cosmic judgment. In India, the ancient city of Dwarka, sacred to Hindus as the legendary city of Krishna, has been found underwater off the coast of Gujarat. Marine archaeology has revealed structures, artifacts, and evidence of a submerged settlement. While the dating and interpretation remain controversial, some researchers suggest this represents a city drowned by sea level rise or by a particularly catastrophic storm surge or tsunami. Around the world, evidence accumulates of coastal populations displaced by rising seas in the period following the last ice age. From Doggerland, the land that once connected Britain to continental Europe, now submerged beneath the North Sea, to Sunderland, the vast landmass that once connected the islands of Southeast Asia, now drowned by the rising ocean. These were not sudden floods in the mythic sense, but rather inexorable processes unfolding over centuries. Yet for the people experiencing them, watching the sea advance generation by generation, consuming ancestral lands, the effect would be traumatic. Stories of these drownings could easily be transformed into myths of sudden catastrophic floods. But there is also evidence of more sudden flooding events. Lake Agassiz, a vast glacial lake in North America formed from melting ice sheets, catastrophically drained multiple times around 13,000 years ago. When ice dams holding back the lake failed, incomprehensible volumes of water rushed out, flooding down through various routes to reach the ocean. One drainage event may have sent so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that it disrupted the ocean currents, triggering a brief return to Ice Age conditions called the Younger Dryas period. This shows how catastrophic floods can have global climatic impacts. In the Mediterranean, evidence suggests the Aegean Sea experienced rapid rises in level that would have displaced coastal populations throughout the Greek islands. The legend of Atlantis may preserve memory of island settlements lost to the sea, though no evidence for the elaborate civilization Plato describes has been found. Archaeological evidence thus paints a complex picture. No single global flood erased all civilization, but numerous regional floods, both sudden and gradual, affected populations throughout the world. These events would be preserved in cultural memory, shaped by retelling into the myths we have examined. The archaeological evidence supports the idea that flood myths are rooted in real events, even if those events were smaller in scale and more local than the universal deluges described in myths. Our ancestors were not inventing stories from nothing. They were trying to explain and preserve memories of actual catastrophes that disrupted their lives. Let your mind rest now, picturing ancient shores where the sea advanced slowly, year by year. Imagine the concern turning to fear as people realized the water would not stop. Feel the loss of land their ancestors had known for generations. This was real for them, as real as the ground beneath them, until that ground was consumed by water. Part 10. The geological record speaks beyond archaeology. The Earth itself preserves evidence of dramatic water events in deep time. let us examine what geology reveals about floods, both ancient and catastrophic, that shaped our world. The end of the last ice age, beginning roughly 20,000 years ago and intensifying around 15,000 years ago, represents the most dramatic climatic change in recent geological time. Vast ice sheets covering much of North America, Europe and Asia began to melt. The water locked in this ice, hundreds of feet of sea level equivalent, gradually returned to the oceans. Sea level did not rise uniformly or smoothly. There were periods of rapid rise called meltwater pulses, when ice sheets collapsed and enormous volumes of water entered the ocean in relatively short time periods. Meltwater pulse 1A, occurring around 14,600 years ago, may have raised global sea level by 60 to 80 feet in less than 500 years. This is catastrophically fast in human terms. Imagine living on a coastal plain and watching the sea rise several inches per decade. Your grandfather's stories about fishing grounds would describe places now underwater. The beach of your childhood would be gone. Coastal villages would be progressively abandoned as fields became marsh, marsh became lagoon, lagoon became open sea. For pre-literate societies without written records, such changes would be preserved in oral tradition, compressed and dramatized. A gradual rise over centuries becomes, in mythic retelling, a sudden catastrophic flood. The essential truth, that the sea consumed the land and forced migration, remains accurate even as the timeline compresses, but some flood events truly were sudden. We have mentioned the Missoula floods, but their scale deserves fuller description. These floods occurred when ice dams holding back glacial Lake Missoula in Montana repeatedly failed. Each time the ice dam broke, up to 500 cubic miles of water burst out, flowing west across Washington state toward the Pacific. The force of these floods is almost incomprehensible. Water flowed at speeds of 80 miles per hour, carrying icebergs the size of houses, boulders the size of cars. The floods scoured the landscape down to bedrock, creating the channeled scablands, a landscape unique on Earth. The water backed up behind obstacles, creating temporary lakes hundreds of feet deep, then resumed its rush when the obstacle was overtopped or eroded away. These floods emptied the lake in as little as 48 hours. Then the ice dam would reform, the lake would refill over decades or centuries, and eventually the dam would fail again. This cycle repeated as many as 100 times between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. If humans were present in the Pacific Northwest during these floods, and evidence suggests they may have been, the experience would be apocalyptic beyond imagining. The roar of the water audible for miles, the ground shaking, an advancing wall of water, ice and debris. Survival would depend on being far enough from the flood path or high enough above it. Could the flood myths of Pacific Northwest tribes preserve memories of the Missoula floods? The timeline is tight, at the edge of how long oral tradition might preserve accurate information. But the floods occurred within the period of human habitation of the Americas. It is not impossible that stories of these events were passed down, eventually transformed into the flood myths recorded by anthropologists thousands of years later. Similar catastrophic outburst floods occurred elsewhere. In Siberia, enormous glacial lakes drained when ice dams failed. In South America, glacial Lake Patagonia released massive floods. In Central Asia, ancient lakes far larger than their modern remnants show evidence of catastrophic drainage events. The Mediterranean itself experienced dramatic flooding in deep prehistory. About 5.3 million years ago, during an event called the Zanclean Flood, the Atlantic broke through the Strait of Gibraltar and refilled the Mediterranean basin, which had largely dried up when the strait was closed by tectonic movements. This flood was unimaginably large, possibly filling the Mediterranean in as little as 2 years, but it occurred millions of years before humans evolved, so it could not be preserved in cultural memory. However, the Mediterranean has experienced smaller but still significant flooding events within the time of human civilization. The Sea of Marmara, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, has fluctuated in level. The Aegean Sea has risen to flood low-lying lands. The Nile Delta has been repeatedly drowned and built up by sediment deposition. Tsunami evidence also appears in the geological record around the Mediterranean. The eruption of Santorini, around 3,600 years ago, generated a massive tsunami that struck coastlines throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This event destroyed Minoan settlements on Crete and may have contributed to the collapse of that civilization. Could the Santorini tsunami be the source of Atlantis legends? Some researchers think so. A powerful maritime civilization, suddenly destroyed by a catastrophic volcanic eruption and tsunami, sinking into the sea? The parallels are suggestive, even if the details do not perfectly match Plato's account. Tsunamis have struck coastlines throughout human history, some large enough to seem like the end of the world to those who experienced them. The 2011 Tohoku tsunami in Japan, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the 1755 Lisbon tsunami, all showed how suddenly the ocean can rise and consume the land. Ancient tsunamis would have left similar traumatic memories. In the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, evidence exists for rapid sea level changes that would have dramatically altered coastlines. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, has closed and opened with sea level fluctuations. When closed, the Red Sea becomes a salt lake. When opened, it refills. These cycles could create dramatic flooding of shoreline areas. Some researchers have proposed that the biblical Red Sea crossing preserves a memory of walking across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait during a period when it was exposed by low sea level, a route out of Africa that early humans might have used. This is speculative, but it shows how geological events might be preserved in myth. The Himalayan region, where many Asian flood myths place their ending, has its own dramatic water history. Glacial lakes in the mountains can burst through natural dams, creating outburst floods that race down valleys, destroying everything in their path. These glacial lake outburst floods, called jlefs, continue to threaten populations in Nepal, Bhutan and India today. Ancient glyphs could explain the Hindu tradition of floods coming from the Himalayas. A massive burst of water racing down from the mountains would seem like divine action, the earth itself breaking open to release the deluge. Survivors watching from higher ground would see valleys scoured clean, settlements obliterated, the landscape transformed in hours. Everywhere we look in the geological record we find evidence of dramatic water events. Most occurred before human history, but enough happened during the long span of human existence, especially the dramatic period at the end of the last ice age, that cultural memory could preserve them. The earth itself testifies to the power of water to reshape landscapes, to rise and fall, to destroy and to recreate. The flood myths are not fantasies. They are humanity's attempt to describe and understand real events, to make meaning from catastrophe, to explain why the world changed so dramatically. Your body is completely relaxed now. The tension of the day has dissolved. We journey deeper into the mystery, exploring now one of the most famous and controversial flood-related legends of all. Part 11. Atlantis and Lost Civilizations. No discussion of flood myths and lost worlds would be complete without examining Atlantis, the legendary island civilization that has captivated imagination for over 2,000 years. Let us approach this famous tale with the same careful attention we have given to other flood traditions. The only original source for the Atlantis story is Plato, the Greek philosopher, who wrote about it in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE. Plato presents the story as having been told to Solon, the Athenian statesman, by Egyptian priests during his visit to Egypt around 600 BCE. According to this account, Atlantis was a powerful island nation that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, making it roughly 11,600 years ago. The island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say, past the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was ruled by Atlas, son of Poseidon the sea god, and his descendants. The island was rich beyond measure, with mountains containing precious metals, plains producing abundant crops, and forests full of resources. The Atlanteans built a magnificent capital city, with concentric rings of water and land, connected by bridges and tunnels. The palace at the centre was adorned with gold, silver and orichalcum, a mysterious metal, possibly brass or copper alloy. For generations the Atlantean kings ruled wisely, maintaining virtue and justice. But gradually, their divine nature became diluted by mixing with mortals. They grew proud and ambitious, eventually assembling a great military force to conquer the Mediterranean world. Atlantis successfully subjugated parts of Libya and Europe, advancing as far as Tyrrhenia in Italy and Egypt in the east. Only Athens stood against them. In a great war, the Athenians, displaying legendary courage and skill, defeated the Atlantean forces, but then, in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, the island of Atlantis sank into the ocean, disappearing forever. The Athenian army that had marched against Atlantis was also destroyed by these same catastrophes. All memory of these events was lost in Greece because the survivors were illiterate mountain dwellers who did not preserve the stories, but Egypt, protected from such calamities, maintained the records. This is Plato's account. The question that has obsessed scholars, seekers, and speculators ever since is simple. Was Atlantis real? Most mainstream historians and archaeologists say no. They interpret the story as Plato's philosophical fiction, an allegory about the dangers of pride and the inevitable decline of civilizations that lose their virtue. Plato was writing philosophy, not history. The story serves his didactic purposes, illustrating themes found throughout his work. The numbers in the account seem suspicious. 9,000 years before Solon would be before any known advanced civilization. The size of the island is impossibly large. The description of Athenian civilization at that time does not match archaeological evidence. The story has all the hallmarks of invented allegory. Yet Plato insisted through his characters that the story was true, not fiction. Why would he make this claim if he were inventing the tale? Some suggest he wanted his allegory to carry more weight. Others argue he may have believed the story was true even if it was not. But what if there is some historical core to the Atlantis legend? Not necessarily a massive island empire beyond Gibraltar, but perhaps a real civilization destroyed by natural disaster, the memory of which reached Plato in distorted form. The most popular candidate is the Minoan civilization on Crete and surrounding islands, particularly Santorini. The Minoans were an advanced Bronze Age culture, with impressive palaces, sophisticated art, and maritime trade networks throughout the Mediterranean. Around 3,600 years ago, the volcano on Santorini erupted in one of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history. The eruption destroyed the Santorini settlement of Akrotiri, buried it under ash like Pompeii, and generated a massive tsunami that struck Crete and other coastlines. While this did not literally sink Santorini, which still exists, it did bury the civilization there and severely damaged Minoan Crete. The Minoan culture went into decline soon after, eventually being absorbed by the Mycenaean Greeks. Could this be the source of Atlantis? A powerful maritime civilization, suddenly destroyed by volcanic catastrophe and tsunami, sinking into legend? The timeline does not match Plato's account, being far more recent than 9,000 years before Solon. But if the Egyptian priests were wrong about dates, or if Plato misunderstood the numbers, the Minoan collapse could be the kernel of truth in the Atlantis story. Other researchers have proposed different locations. Some place Atlantis in the Mediterranean, perhaps a sunken landmass near Spain or in the Strait of Sicily. Others identify it with Tartessos, a real but mysterious culture in southern Spain that vanished from history. Some look to the Black Sea, the North Sea, or even Antarctica. The problem is that anyone can find evidence for Atlantis anywhere by selecting convenient facts and ignoring contradictions. This does not mean Atlantis did not exist, but it does mean we should be cautious about claims to have found it. What seems more likely is that Plato's Atlantis combines multiple sources: memories of Minoan civilization, Egyptian stories about Libya, and invaders from the sea, Greek myths about catastrophic floods, and philosophical invention. The result is a compelling narrative that contains fragments of truth wrapped in layers of elaboration and allegory. The Atlantis story speaks to something deep in human consciousness. The fear of losing everything, of civilization's fragility, of cataclysms that can erase the world we know. It embodies our awareness that other peoples, other times, have been lost to memory, swallowed by time and disaster. And perhaps this is the real meaning of Atlantis, not as a specific place to be found, but as a symbol of all lost civilizations, all drowned cities, all forgotten peoples. Throughout history, cultures have risen and fallen, often leaving little trace. Natural disasters have destroyed cities, forced migrations, ended civilizations. The sea peoples who disrupted the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age collapse were never clearly identified. The Indus Valley civilization declined and was forgotten for millennia. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey shows that complex societies existed far earlier than once thought, then disappeared. leaving only megalithic ruins that we are only now rediscovering. The world is full of lost civilizations, not necessarily as advanced as Plato's Atlantis, but lost nonetheless. Flood, earthquake, volcanic eruption, climate change, warfare, disease, any of these can end a society. And in ages before writing was widespread, entire cultures could vanish, leaving barely a trace. This brings us to a broader question. Were there advanced civilizations before recorded history that were destroyed by the catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age? Civilizations that left no clear archaeological evidence, but whose memory persists in the flood myths we have explored? This theory, popularized by writers like Graham Hancock and others, suggests that a sophisticated global civilization existed during the Ice Age, was destroyed by cataclysms around 12,000 years ago, and survivors spread around the world, bringing knowledge to primitive hunter-gatherers, jump-starting the Neolithic Revolution and the rise of civilization. The mainstream archaeological community firmly rejects this idea. There is no credible evidence for advanced Ice Age civilizations. The archaeological record shows a clear progression from simple, hunter-gatherer societies to increasingly complex agricultural and urban civilizations. Claims of ancient advanced technology are based on misinterpretations, selective evidence, and wishful thinking. The pyramids of Egypt and Mexico, the megaliths of Malta and Britain, the precision stonework of Peru, all of these can be explained by the capabilities of the cultures that built them, without invoking lost civilizations or ancient aliens. Ancient peoples were not primitive. They were as intelligent as us, with sophisticated knowledge adapted to their environments and needs. However, the end of the Ice Age did see dramatic changes that might be relevant. This period, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, saw rapid climate change, massive flooding, rising sea levels, and the extinction of megafauna across the Americas and elsewhere. The Younger Dryas event, a brief return to Ice Age conditions, disrupted climates globally. Some researchers propose that a comet impact or airburst around 12,800 years ago triggered the Younger Dryas, causing widespread destruction and environmental collapse. This remains controversial, but if true, it would represent a true global catastrophe within human history. Could such an event, or the rapid flooding at the end of the Ice Age, have destroyed emerging complex societies? Perhaps not advanced civilizations in the modern sense, but developed cultures more sophisticated than the hunter-gatherer bands traditionally imagined. Could these lost peoples be the source of the flood myths, their stories preserved and passed down by survivors? It is possible. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially for coastal settlements that would now be underwater. 90% of human population throughout history has lived near coastlines and rivers. At the end of the Ice Age, these areas were flooded. Any societies that existed there are now beneath the sea. Underwater archaeology is beginning to explore these drowned landscapes. Off India, Japan, the Mediterranean, the Americas, submerged structures, tools and settlements are being discovered. Most date to the period of sea level rise. They show that people were living in areas now underwater, though they do not yet show evidence of advanced lost civilizations. The truth likely lies between the extremes. No global advanced civilization existed before recorded history. But human societies were more widespread, more developed, and more complex than once believed. The catastrophic flooding and climate change at the end of the Ice Age would have destroyed many of these societies, forced mass migrations, and severed cultural continuity. The survivors, carrying memories of their lost homelands, would have spread these stories, which eventually became the flood myths we have examined. Not memories of Atlantis, but of many drowned lands, many lost peoples, many local apocalypses that together created the universal narrative of the flood. Let your breathing deepen. Feel yourself sinking into comfort. The mystery of lost civilizations surrounds you like gentle water, neither threatening nor disturbing, simply present, a reminder of time's depth and history's mysteries. We turn now from speculation about lost civilizations to examine what modern science tells us about ancient floods and whether a global deluge is even possible. Part 12. The Science of Water and Earth. From a purely scientific standpoint, could a flood have covered the entire Earth, even the highest mountains, as many flood myths describe? Let us examine what geology, climatology, and physics tell us. The total volume of water on Earth is essentially constant, cycling between ocean, atmosphere, ice, groundwater and rivers. This is called the hydrological cycle. Water evaporates from oceans, falls as precipitation, flows in rivers back to the sea, or freezes in ice caps and glaciers. The total amount does not significantly change, though its distribution shifts. Currently about 97% of Earth's water is in the oceans. Another 2% is locked in ice caps and glaciers. The remaining 1% is in groundwater, lakes, rivers, atmosphere and living things. If all the ice on Earth melted, sea level would rise by about 230 feet. This would drown coastal cities and low-lying areas, but would not cover mountains or make the Earth a water world. Mount Everest, Earth's highest peak, stands over 29,000 feet above sea level. To cover Everest with water would require adding enormous volumes of water to Earth's system, far more than exists in all the ice, groundwater and atmosphere combined. Where would this water come from? Some religious traditions explain the floodwater as coming from above and below, the windows of heaven opening and the fountains of the deep bursting forth as described in Genesis. From a scientific perspective, there is no known mechanism for this. There is not enough water in the atmosphere to produce such a flood, nor reservoirs beneath the Earth's crust that could release it. The idea of a vapour canopy, a layer of water vapour surrounding the pre-flood Earth that collapsed to produce the deluge, has been proposed by some religious scientists. However, this theory faces serious problems. A vapour canopy thick enough to produce a global flood would create greenhouse conditions incompatible with life. When it condensed, it would release enormous heat, literally boiling the oceans. The physics do not work. From a geological perspective, there is no evidence for a global flood in recent history. The rock layers of Earth show no worldwide flood deposit. Different regions show different geological histories, with no common flood layer at the same time. Fossils are sorted by age in a pattern consistent with evolution over millions of years, not by mixing in a single flood event. If a global flood had occurred 4,000 years ago, as some calculate from biblical chronology, it should have left clear evidence in ice cores, tree rings, sediment layers, and human history. No such evidence exists. Egyptian civilization, for instance, shows continuous occupation through this period with no flood interruption. The Great Pyramid was already ancient by this time, so from a scientific standpoint, a recent global flood covering all mountains is not supported by evidence and faces serious physical impossibilities. Does this mean the flood myths are entirely false? Not necessarily. The myths may preserve memories of regional floods that seemed global to those who experienced them. For an ancient people whose world was a river valley or coastal plain, a massive flood that drowned their entire territory would be their whole world flooding. They had no knowledge of distant continents unaffected by the event. The Mesopotamian floods we discussed earlier would have covered the entire known world for the Sumerians living in the river valley. From their perspective, the whole Earth was flooded, because their Earth, their territory, their civilization was under water. The myth universalizes their local experience. Similarly, the rise in sea level at the end of the Ice Age, while gradual on geological timescales, was rapid enough in human terms to be catastrophic. Coastal populations would see the sea advancing generation by generation. Over centuries, vast areas were drowned. For coastal peoples, this was a flood, even if it took decades or centuries to unfold. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis, if correct, would have been sudden enough to seem like a biblical flood to those around its shores. A year or two of water rising, advancing miles inland, unstoppable. This is functionally equivalent to a sudden flood from the perspective of human experience. Tsunamis provide another mechanism for flood myths. A major tsunami can inundate coastal areas within minutes, appearing like the sea rising to consume the land. The destruction is total and sudden. To survivors, it would seem like divine judgment, the ocean itself attacking the shore. Modern science thus does not support a literal global flood, but it does provide mechanisms for regional catastrophic flooding that could inspire and explain flood myths. The myths are not scientifically accurate about the scale of flooding, but they may be historically accurate about the human experience of catastrophic floods. This is an important distinction. Myths are not scientific reports. They are cultural narratives that preserve meaning, identity, and memory. They translate experiences into archetypes, compress time, expand scale, and add supernatural elements. But this does not make them false in the deeper sense of preserving real human experiences of disaster and survival. The flood myths tell us that our ancestors experienced catastrophic floods, that these floods traumatized cultures and forced migrations, that the memory of these events was important enough to preserve across millennia. This is true, even if the specific details about mountains being covered or the entire Earth flooding are exaggerations. Science and myth are answering different questions. Science asks, what physically happened according to evidence and natural laws? Myth asks, what did this mean for us? How do we understand it? What does it tell us about our relationship with the divine and with nature? Both are valid forms of knowledge, each in its proper sphere. The scientific understanding of Ice Age flooding, sea level rise, and regional deluges enriches our interpretation of flood myths without invalidating them. The myths give human meaning to geological processes, transforming impersonal natural events into narratives of judgment, salvation, and renewal. Your mind is quiet now, floating peacefully on these deep waters of understanding. The tension between myth and science dissolves into a deeper appreciation of how humans make meaning from experience. Let us continue now to explore more specific theories about what might have caused the floods remembered in myth. Ziusudra, Part 13. The Younger Dryas and Cosmic Catastrophe. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating, sea levels rising, climate warming. Then suddenly the warming reversed. Temperatures plummeted back to ice age conditions. This cold period lasted about 1,200 years before warming resumed. Geologists call this event the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a global phenomenon affecting climates worldwide. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. Areas that had warmed became cold. Megafauna like mammoths, which had survived the Ice Age for millions of years, went extinct across North America and northern Eurasia. What caused the Younger Dryas? The traditional explanation involves changes in ocean circulation. As ice sheets melted, vast amounts of fresh water entered the North Atlantic, disrupting the thermohaline circulation, the system of currents that distributes heat around the globe. With this heat conveyor turned off, temperatures dropped, especially in the northern hemisphere. The source of the fresh water was likely Lake Agassiz, which catastrophically drained into the Atlantic or Arctic Ocean, or both in succession. This massive pulse of fresh water lowered the salinity and density of surface waters, preventing them from sinking and driving the deep ocean currents. Without these currents, heat distribution ceased, temperatures fell, and ice age conditions returned. But in recent decades, an alternative theory has been proposed. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid impact triggered the event. Evidence cited includes a layer of sediment dated to the start of the Younger Dryas that contains unusual materials: nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, high concentrations of platinum, and iridium, and charcoal indicating widespread fires. Proponents argue that a large comet broke apart in the inner solar system, with fragments striking Earth around 12,800 years ago. The impacts or airbursts caused widespread destruction, ignited continental-scale wildfires, and threw dust into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the climate. The shock waves and heat could have caused rapid ice sheet collapse, sending fresh water into the oceans and further disrupting climate. This theory remains highly controversial. Many scientists dispute the evidence, arguing that the markers cited could have other origins, and that impact craters from this event have not been conclusively identified. The debate continues in scientific journals and conferences, with passionate arguments on both sides. If the impact hypothesis is correct, it would mean that human cultures worldwide experienced a genuine global catastrophe within historical memory. Not a flood in the traditional sense, but a cosmic disaster bringing fire, darkness, climate chaos, and subsequent flooding as ice rapidly melted. Could this be the ultimate source of flood myths? The timeline fits reasonably well. 12,800 years ago is within the range of dates given in some flood myths, especially if we allow for errors in ancient chronology. It is also precisely the period when sea levels were rising most rapidly, coastal areas flooding, and human populations would be most affected. The extinction of megafauna in the Americas around this time has long puzzled scientists. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and many other large animals disappeared relatively suddenly. Previously, this was attributed to human hunting or climate change. The impact hypothesis offers an alternative. These animals were killed by the direct and indirect effects of cosmic impacts. Some indigenous American traditions speak of a time of fire and darkness, stars falling from the sky, the earth shaking. Could these be memories of the Younger Dryas impacts? Oral traditions maintaining accurate information for nearly 13,000 years seems extraordinary, but not impossible. Aboriginal Australian traditions appear to preserve information over similar or even longer timescales. Another piece of potential evidence comes from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a megalithic site dated to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, around 11,600 years ago. This remarkable site contains massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with animal figures and abstract symbols. One pillar, dubbed the vulture stone, contains what some researchers interpret as astronomical symbols, recording a comet impact. The carvings show a figure that could represent the constellation Scorpius, with a headless figure that might symbolise catastrophe. If this interpretation is correct, Göbekli Tepe might be a memorial to the Younger Dryas event, built by survivors to commemorate the disaster and perhaps predict future occurrences. This interpretation is speculative and disputed. The symbols could mean many things, but the fact that people were building such sophisticated structures so soon after the Younger Dryas suggests that something significant had changed in human culture. The site represents one of the earliest known examples of monumental architecture, suggesting organised labour, complex society, and shared belief systems. What if the Younger Dryas event, whether caused by impacts or climate disruption, was traumatic enough to spur cultural development? Survivors, facing a harsher world, might have needed to organise more effectively, cooperate more extensively, develop new technologies and social structures. The disaster could have been a crucible forcing human innovation. Many of the first signs of agriculture appear shortly after the Younger Dryas. The Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, began in the Fertile Crescent around this time. Could post-Younger Dryas climate and ecological changes have pushed humans toward agriculture? Or could population dislocations from flooding have concentrated people in areas where agriculture became necessary? The connection between the Younger Dryas, potential cosmic impacts, post-Ice Age flooding, and the rise of civilization is speculative but intriguing. It suggests a possibility that a genuine global catastrophe occurred at the end of the Ice Age, that this event was preserved in flood myths worldwide, and that its aftermath shaped the emergence of the first civilizations. Even if the impact hypothesis is wrong, and the Younger Dryas was purely a climate event, the effect on human populations was significant. This was a period of rapid environmental change, extinction events, flooding coastlines and stressed ecosystems. Humans living through it would have experienced true catastrophe. Imagine being alive during those centuries. The world your grandparents knew is gone. Animals they hunted are extinct. Coastlines they fished have drowned. The climate has turned cold again just when it seemed to be warming. Resources are scarce. Tribes are migrating, competing for territory. Everything is uncertain. In such a context, stories of floods and destruction would not just be explanations but also warnings, moral teachings, reminders of fragility, and assertions of continuity despite catastrophe. The flood myths become survival literature, encoding both memory and meaning. Your eyelids are heavy now. Your breath comes slow and deep. The ancient past surrounds you like a comforting darkness, full of mysteries that need not be solved tonight. Simply rest in the knowledge that your ancestors survived, that they persevered through catastrophes we can barely imagine, and that their stories reached across millennia to us. Let us move now to examine specific places around the world where flood evidence is particularly striking, where the marriage of myth and geology is especially clear. Part 14. Drowned lands and sunken shores. Beneath the waves of the world's oceans lie landscapes that were once dry land, inhabited by our ancestors. These drowned lands, submerged by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, represent lost worlds whose memory might be preserved in flood myths. Let us explore some of these fascinating places. Doggerland, now beneath the North Sea between Britain and Europe, was once a rich lowland landscape of rivers, marshes, forests and hills. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, Britain was not an island but part of the European continent. Doggerland was the plain connecting them, an area larger than many modern countries. archaeological evidence from the North Sea, brought up by fishing trawlers and marine surveys, shows that Doggerland was inhabited. Stone tools, bone artefacts, and remains of animals have been recovered from the seafloor. Seismic surveys reveal river systems, hills, and even what appear to be lake beds, all now underwater. Doggerland was gradually submerged as sea levels rose, the process taking thousands of years. But around 8,200 years ago, the flooding may have accelerated dramatically. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, called the Storegga Slide, generated a tsunami that struck the coastlines of Scotland, England, and likely Doggerland itself. This tsunami, combined with the ongoing sea level rise, may have been the final catastrophe that completed Doggerland's submergence. For people living there, the experience would be of their world literally drowning, being consumed by the advancing sea. Survivors would have fled to the higher ground that became the British Isles, or back to continental Europe, carrying memories of the lost land. Could British flood traditions preserve memories of Doggerland's drowning? It is possible, though most British flood myths seem to be later imports from continental or biblical sources. But the drowning of Doggerland is a real event that would have affected populations, forcing migrations and cultural changes. It is not mere speculation, but documented geological fact that a populated land was submerged. Across the world, similar drowned landscapes exist. Sundaland, the vast region connecting the islands of Southeast Asia during the Ice Age, was submerged as seas rose. This area, encompassing what is now the Java Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, and the shallow waters between Indonesia, Malaysia and Indochina, was a lowland plain during glacial periods. Sundaland would have been tropical, rich in resources, and likely well populated. It may have served as a corridor for human migration from mainland Asia into the islands and eventually to Australia. When sea levels rose, this entire region flooded, separating islands that had been connected, transforming plains into seas. The flood myths of Southeast Asian and Pacific peoples may preserve memories of Sunderland's drowning. The stories of islands that once were larger, of lands now lost to the sea, of ancestors fleeing rising waters, could be folk memories passed down across hundreds of generations. The Sahel continental shelf connected Australia, Tasmania and New Guinea during the Ice Age. As seas rose, Tasmania was cut off from Australia around 14,000 years ago. New Guinea separated around 8,000 years ago. Aboriginal Australian and Papua New Guinean oral traditions speak of times when the sea was lower, when one could walk to places now islands, when coastlines were far from their present positions. Some of these oral traditions show remarkable accuracy when compared to geological data. Stories describe specific landmarks now underwater, coastlines that match reconstructions of ancient shore positions, and events that correlate with known sea level changes. This suggests that oral tradition can preserve accurate information for thousands of years, longer than written records have existed. In the Persian Gulf, the entire gulf was dry land or a river valley during the Ice Age, with the Tigris and Euphrates joining to flow through what is now sea. As sea levels rose, the gulf gradually filled, flooding from south to north over several thousand years. The final flooding of the northern Gulf region occurred roughly 8,000 years ago. This region, fertile and well-watered, might have supported significant populations. If so, the gradual flooding would have forced northward migration into Mesopotamia. Could this be the origin of the Sumerian flood myths? Peoples displaced from the drowned Gulf Valley, settling in Mesopotamia, bringing memories of their lost homeland? Some researchers identify the Persian Gulf flooding with the Garden of Eden, suggesting that the biblical paradise was the Gulf Valley before it was flooded. This is speculative, but the timeline and geography are suggestive. A fertile valley with 4 rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, and 2 that flowed through what is now the Gulf, inhabited by early agricultural peoples then drowned by rising seas. It fits the pattern of a lost paradise. Off the coast of India, submerged structures and settlements have been found in the Gulf of Kambat and near other coastal areas. The dating and interpretation of these remains is controversial, but they show that coastal areas now underwater were once occupied. The flooding of these areas would have displaced populations and created flood memories. Indian tradition speaks of Kumari Kandam, a legendary lost continent said to have existed south of India, now submerged beneath the Indian Ocean. This is often dismissed as myth, but it might preserve memory of larger land areas when sea level was lower, or of coastal regions lost to rising seas. In the Americas, the Pacific coast has extensive underwater terrain that was above sea level during the Ice Age. The Kelp Highway hypothesis suggests that human migration into the Americas occurred along the Pacific coast, with people following kelp forests and exploiting marine resources. If so, evidence of these migrations now lies underwater. Off the coast of Florida, sinkholes that formed on dry land when sea level was lower have been found underwater. Diving in these sinkholes has recovered evidence of human occupation, including tools and human remains dating to over 14,000 years ago. These finds prove that people were living in areas now submerged. Around the world, underwater archaeology is revealing a lost world. Not Atlantis in the mythical sense, but real landscapes that were inhabited and then drowned. The drowning was usually gradual, but to peoples living through it, the relentless advance of the sea would be traumatic and memorable. These drowned lands represent a missing chapter of human history. We know the Ice Age ended and seas rose, but we often forget that this process destroyed the world our ancestors knew. It forced mass migrations, cultural disruptions, and probably conflicts over remaining dry land. It was a true catastrophe in slow motion. The flood myths, then, are not fantasies but history, encoded in narrative form, passed down through countless generations. They tell us where we have been, what we have survived, and perhaps warn us about what could happen again. For sea levels could rise again. If climate change continues, if ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica melt, seas will rise once more, drowning modern coastal cities just as ancient coastlines were drowned. The flood myths remind us that such transformations are possible, that the seemingly solid earth can be consumed by water, that human civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. Let yourself drift now, imagining these lost landscapes beneath the waves. See forests now drowned, valleys now filled with salt water, hills that have become seamounts. These places once echoed with human voices, with laughter and sorrow, with ordinary lives now lost to time and tide. Rest peacefully, knowing that though worlds can drown, humanity endures. Part 15. The Flood in Religious and Philosophical Context. Beyond historical and geological questions, flood myths have profound religious and philosophical significance. They address fundamental questions about humanity's relationship with the divine, about judgment and mercy, about destruction and renewal. Let us explore these deeper meanings. In most religious traditions, the flood is not merely a natural disaster, but a divine act. It represents God or the gods deciding that humanity has become so corrupted that complete destruction is necessary. Only by wiping the slate clean can the world begin again. This raises difficult theological questions. Why would a benevolent deity destroy almost all of creation? What crime could be so great as to warrant near total extinction? And how do we reconcile divine mercy with such comprehensive violence? Different traditions answer these questions differently. In the Mesopotamian accounts, the gods are almost capricious, destroying humanity because their noise is annoying. This reflects a worldview where gods are powerful but not necessarily just, where humans are vulnerable to divine whims, and where survival depends on the favour of one sympathetic deity. The biblical account presents a more moral framework. Humanity is destroyed because of wickedness, violence, and corruption. Every inclination of the human heart is toward evil. The flood becomes divine judgment, removing evil from the world. Yet mercy is shown through Noah, preserving the righteous and allowing humanity to continue. This pattern of judgment and mercy appears in many flood traditions. The flood is both punishment and purification. It destroys the old corrupt world but preserves seeds of the new. It is ending and beginning simultaneously, death and rebirth, apocalypse and Genesis. The Rainbow Covenant after the biblical flood represents God's promise never to destroy the earth so completely again. This is significant theologically. It suggests divine regret, or at least divine self-limitation. God will not again use such comprehensive violence, even if humanity again becomes wicked. The flood is unique, unrepeatable. But what does the flood story tell us about human nature? One interpretation is that humans are fundamentally flawed, prone to wickedness, requiring divine intervention to prevent self-destruction. The flood shows what happens when evil goes unchecked, when society becomes completely corrupt. It serves as warning and moral lesson. Another interpretation sees the flood as recognizing human potential for both good and evil. Noah represents the possibility of righteousness even in a wicked generation. The survival of Noah and his family shows that individuals can resist corruption, that good can persist even when surrounded by evil. The flood is not about human worthlessness, but about the crucial importance of individual virtue. The flood also represents cosmic reset, the idea that when things become too broken, starting over is necessary. This is a deeply appealing notion in times of crisis or corruption. The world seems so broken that only comprehensive destruction can fix it. The flood myth gives expression to this desire for complete renewal, even at the cost of complete destruction. Philosophically, the flood raises questions about continuity and change. If the world is destroyed and remade, is it the same world? Noah's world after the flood is fundamentally different from the world before. Animals now fear humans, humans now eat meat. The lifespan of humans begins to decrease. Violence is acknowledged and regulated. The post-flood world operates under different rules. This suggests that catastrophes do not merely interrupt history but transform it. The world before the flood and after the flood are different eras, different dispensations. Humanity itself is changed by the experience of near extinction. In Hindu cosmology, as we discussed earlier, floods mark transitions between world ages. This is a cyclical view, where creation and destruction alternate eternally. Each age ends in catastrophe, followed by renewal and the next age. The flood is not unique, but part of the cosmic rhythm of time. This cyclical view contrasts with the linear view of biblical tradition, where the flood happens once, in historical time, after which God promises never to repeat it. The difference reflects different understandings of time and cosmic order. Is time circular, with events repeating eternally, or linear, with unique, unrepeatable events moving toward a final endpoint? The flood myths also explore the theme of chosenness or election. Why is Noah saved and not others? What makes him righteous when everyone else is wicked? Different traditions answer this differently, but all agree that survival is not random. Those who survive do so because they are chosen, either for their virtue or by divine favour. This can be comforting to those who identify with the survivors. We are the inheritors of Noah, the descendants of those chosen to continue. We survived because our ancestors were righteous or favoured, but it also creates uncomfortable questions about those who did not survive. Did they deserve to die? Were entire populations, including children, so evil that their destruction was just? Some religious traditions struggle with these questions. Jewish and Christian scholars have written extensively about the justice of the flood, about whether children could be held guilty, about whether the destruction was truly necessary. The questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps why the story remains so powerful and so troubling. In philosophical terms, the flood myth addresses the problem of evil. How do we explain the presence of evil in a world created by good divinity? One answer the flood provides is that evil comes from human free will, and becomes so entrenched that only destruction can remove it. But this simply pushes the question back. Why allow evil to develop so extensively before intervening? The flood myth also speaks to theodicy, the question of divine justice. If God is just, why do the innocent suffer? In the flood, presumably many who died were not actively wicked, yet all perished. The biblical text says that every inclination was toward evil, but can this really apply to infants and children? The question haunts the story, yet the story's endurance suggests it serves important psychological and cultural functions despite these difficulties. It provides a narrative framework for understanding catastrophe, for making sense of disaster. When terrible things happen, the flood story offers a template. Destruction is followed by preservation, endings lead to beginnings, even the worst catastrophes can be survived. The story also validates human fears of divine power and natural forces. The world can be destroyed, humanity is vulnerable, civilization is fragile. These are true and important recognitions. The flood myth does not deny these fears, but acknowledges them while also asserting that survival is possible. In an age of climate change, the flood myths have renewed relevance. Rising seas, extreme weather, environmental catastrophe. These are not merely ancient memories, but contemporary realities and future threats. The flood myths remind us that such changes have happened before, that they can be devastating, and that human action matters in the face of catastrophe. Your breathing is very slow now, deep and regular. The philosophical questions dissolve into the peace of acceptance. The flood myths, whatever their historical basis, speak truths about human experience, about fear and hope, about destruction and survival. Rest in these ancient stories, these timeless narratives that connect us to countless generations of ancestors who pondered the same questions. Let us continue now into the final sections of our journey, exploring how the flood myths have influenced culture, art, and imagination across the centuries. Part 16. The Flood in Art, Literature and Culture. The flood myth has inspired countless works of art, literature, music, and cultural expression across millennia. Let us take a gentle journey through some of these creative responses to the deluge narrative. In visual art, depictions of Noah's Ark and the flood appear from the earliest Christian art through the Renaissance and into modern times. Byzantine mosaics show Noah and his family on the ark surrounded by waters. Medieval illuminated manuscripts illustrate the building of the ark, the boarding of animals, and the dove returning with the olive branch. Renaissance masters brought psychological depth to the flood narrative. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel includes powerful frescoes of the deluge, showing desperate humans clinging to rocks as waters rise, their terror and despair palpable. The painting captures the catastrophic moment, the overwhelming force of divine judgment. Gustave Doré, the 19th century illustrator, created haunting engravings of the flood for his illustrated Bible. His images show vast, dark waters, tiny figures overwhelmed by the scale of destruction, the ark floating serenely while below, humanity drowns. The contrast between the saved and the damned is stark and disturbing. In literature, the flood has been endlessly retold and reimagined. Medieval mystery plays included the flood as a standard episode, often played for both drama and comedy. The York Cycle's Noah play shows Noah's wife refusing to board the ark, leading to a marital dispute that ends with her reluctant agreement. This adds human drama to divine catastrophe. John Milton's Paradise Lost mentions the flood as part of human history foreseen by Adam. The flood becomes one consequence of the fall, part of the punishment and redemption narrative that structures Christian salvation history. Lord Byron's poem Heaven and Earth dramatises the flood's approach, focusing on the relationship between human women and fallen angels in the days before catastrophe. The poem captures the despair of those not chosen for salvation, watching the ark being built but unable to board. In modern literature, the flood has been reimagined in countless ways. Julian Barnes's A History of the World in 10.5 chapters begins with a subversive retelling from the perspective of woodworms who stowed away on the ark. This comic approach reveals the absurdities and practicalities of the literal ark story, while using it as a launching point for deeper explorations of history and narrative. Margaret Atwood's The Flood poems explore environmental and spiritual dimensions of the flood narrative in contemporary context. The flood becomes metaphor for environmental catastrophe, for the destruction humans bring upon themselves, for the possibility of renewal after destruction. In children's literature, the Ark story appears in countless picture books, usually presented as an adventure story with cute animals. This sanitized version removes the disturbing elements of mass death and focuses on Noah's care for the animals, the adventure of life on the Ark, and the happy ending with the rainbow. It becomes a story about conservation and cooperation rather than judgment and destruction. In music, Britain's Noise Flood is a church opera that retells the story with simple melodies and opportunities for children's participation. It was designed to be performed in churches with amateur performers, bringing the community together around the ancient narrative. Spirituals and gospel songs have long drawn on flood imagery. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and similar songs place the flood narrative in the context of African American religious experience, finding parallels between biblical deliverance and the hope for freedom from oppression. Folk songs and sea shanties sometimes reference the flood, usually focusing on the practical aspects of managing animals on the ark. These songs are often humorous, imagining the chaos of keeping all those creatures fed and clean for months. In popular culture, the flood and ark have appeared in countless films and television shows. The story provides dramatic spectacle, moral conflict, and a ready-made 3-act structure. From silent films to modern CGI epics, filmmakers have been drawn to the challenge of depicting the flood's scale and the ark's improbable voyage. Some film versions attempt fidelity to the biblical narrative. Others take creative liberties, adding action, romance, or messages about environmentalism. The 2014 film Noah, starring Russell Crowe, reimagined the story with fantastical elements and environmental themes, sparking debate about how freely one can adapt sacred narratives. The ark itself has become an iconic image, instantly recognisable even to those unfamiliar with the full story. A boat filled with paired animals, a bearded man at the helm, a dove with an olive branch. These images appear in everything from children's toys to corporate logos to political cartoons. The flood narrative has also inspired theme parks and attractions. Full-scale Ark replicas have been built in several countries, most notably the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, a massive wooden structure built to biblical dimensions. These attractions combine religious education with entertainment, allowing visitors to imagine the experience of life aboard the Ark. In video games, the flood appears both directly and as inspiration for game mechanics. Survival games, where players must gather resources before catastrophe strikes, echo the Ark building narrative. Strategy games incorporate flood mechanics, challenging players to manage populations through disaster. The flood has entered our language and metaphors. We speak of opening the floodgates, of being deluged with work, of deluge as synonymous with overwhelming quantity. 40 days and 40 nights has become shorthand for a long, difficult period. Olive branch universally symbolises peace. These linguistic traces show how deeply the flood narrative has penetrated collective consciousness. In contemporary art, the flood continues to inspire. Installation artists have created immersive flood experiences using water, sound, and light to evoke the catastrophe. Photographers document modern floods and rising seas, creating visual echoes of the ancient narrative while commenting on climate change. The Ark has been reimagined in contemporary sculpture and architecture. Artists create ark-like vessels filled with plants, animals, or messages about conservation. Architects design flood-resistant structures inspired by the Ark's ability to survive catastrophe. The ancient story continues to generate new creative responses. In comedy and satire, the flood story provides rich material. The practical absurdities of fitting all animals on one boat, the domestic disputes between Noah and his wife, the question of what happened to the fish, these have been mined for humour across centuries. This comic tradition shows how familiar narratives can be approached from unexpected angles. Even in secular contexts, the flood narrative structure appears. Post-apocalyptic fiction often follows the Ark pattern. Catastrophe destroys the world. A small group survives. They must rebuild civilization. The flood provides the template for countless stories of disaster and survival, even when no actual flood appears. Your mind drifts through this gallery of flood images and stories, each one a variation on the ancient theme. The creative response to the flood narrative shows how deeply it resonates with human imagination. It is not just a story from the past, but a living narrative that continues to evolve and inspire. Let us move now to examine how the flood myths connect to modern environmental concerns and what they might teach us about our current relationship with nature and catastrophe. Part 17. The Flood and Modern Environmental Awareness. In our current age of climate change, rising sea levels, and increasing extreme weather events, the ancient flood myths have taken on new relevance. They speak to our contemporary situation in ways that our ancestors could not have anticipated. Let your mind explore these modern connections as you sink deeper into restful contemplation. Today, sea level rise is not myth, but measured reality. Satellites and tide gauges document the ocean's gradual advance. Current projections suggest that by the end of this century, sea levels could rise by several feet, and if ice sheets collapse more rapidly than expected, the rise could be much more dramatic. Coastal cities around the world face the prospect of regular flooding and eventually permanent inundation. Small island nations in the Pacific and Indian Ocean are already planning for the possibility that their entire countries may become uninhabitable. The Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, these places could become the Atlantises of our time, lost to rising seas within generations. Bangladesh, with its vast river delta home to hundreds of millions of people, faces catastrophic flooding as seas rise and storms intensify. Parts of Florida, Louisiana, and other low-lying coastal areas in the United States are already experiencing more frequent flooding. Major cities like Miami, New Orleans, Venice, Bangkok, and Shanghai are all vulnerable. This is not the sudden, apocalyptic flood of myth, but a gradual, inexorable rise that will unfold over decades and centuries. Yet the effect will be similar: displacement of populations, loss of ancestral lands, forced migrations, cultural disruption. Our descendants may tell flood stories about our time, about the world that was drowned when the ice melted. The flood myths remind us that such transformations have happened before. They provide a framework for understanding what rising seas mean, not just in terms of property loss and economic cost, but in terms of human meaning, cultural memory, and collective trauma. Our ancestors survived the flooding of their world. We may need to survive the flooding of ours. But the flood myths also contain warnings. In most traditions, the flood comes as judgment on human behaviour. Wickedness, violence, corruption, or simply disturbing the gods. Human action triggers divine response. This resonates with our current situation, where human activity, specifically greenhouse gas emissions, is driving climate change and sea level rise. We are, in a sense, bringing the flood upon ourselves, not through moral corruption in a traditional religious sense, but through our treatment of the environment, our consumption of resources, our alteration of atmospheric chemistry. The mechanism is scientific rather than supernatural, but the pattern is familiar. Human behaviour leads to catastrophe. The flood myths also emphasise the importance of heeding warnings and preparing. Noah builds the ark because he listens to divine warning and acts on it. The moral is clear. When warned of coming disaster, prepare. Do not ignore the signs. Take the threat seriously even if others mock you. Today, scientists serve the role of prophets, warning about climate change, sea level rise, and environmental catastrophe. The question is whether we will heed these warnings, whether we will build our metaphorical arks, or whether we will continue business as usual until the waters rise beyond our ability to respond. The ark itself becomes a powerful metaphor for environmental conservation. Noah preserves pairs of every species, ensuring biodiversity survives the catastrophe. In our time, we face a mass extinction event driven by human activity. Species are disappearing at rates not seen since the extinction of the dinosaurs. The ark reminds us of the importance of preservation, of ensuring that life in its diversity survives our impact. Modern conservation efforts literally echo the ark narrative. Seed banks preserve plant genetics. Frozen zoos store DNA and genetic material from endangered species. Captive breeding programs maintain populations of creatures nearly extinct in the wild. These are our arks, our attempts to preserve life through catastrophe. The Rainbow Covenant takes on new meaning as well. After the flood, God promises never to destroy the earth so completely again, and the rainbow serves as a reminder of this promise. Today, rainbows appear in environmental symbolism, representing hope, promise, and the interconnection of heaven and earth through water and light. But the covenant also implies human responsibility. If God will not destroy the earth, but humans have the power to damage it severely, then we bear responsibility for what happens. The flood will not come from divine judgment, but from our own actions. The covenant shifts responsibility from deity to humanity. Indigenous environmental philosophy often emphasizes living in balance with nature, respecting the earth, taking only what is needed, and giving back. Many indigenous flood traditions include this moral dimension. The flood comes when humans forget proper relationship with nature, when they become greedy, wasteful, or disrespectful. This resonates with ecological awareness. Environmental degradation stems from treating nature as mere resource to be exploited rather than as sacred or as part of an interconnected system requiring respect and care. The flood myths, particularly indigenous versions, remind us of this older understanding. The flood narratives also address collective versus individual responsibility. In most versions, humanity as a whole is judged, though only one family is saved. This raises questions relevant to climate change. The effects of environmental damage are collective and global, even though responsibility is unequally distributed. Wealthy nations and individuals have contributed far more to climate change than poor nations and individuals, yet all will face consequences. The flood story's emphasis on the righteous survivor suggests the importance of individual virtue and action even within collective catastrophe. We cannot control what all of humanity does, but we can control our own actions. We can live more sustainably, consume less, protect nature, and teach our children to do the same. Like Noah, we can be righteous in our generation, even if we cannot make everyone else righteous. The period after the flood, of rebuilding and renewal, also offers hope. Even after catastrophic loss, new beginnings are possible. Humanity and nature are resilient. Life finds a way to continue, adapt, and flourish. This is not license for complacency. Better to prevent catastrophe than to rely on recovery afterward. But it does offer hope that even if we fail to prevent serious climate damage, survival and renewal remain possible. The flood myths emerged from cultures deeply connected to nature, dependent on weather patterns, river cycles, and seasonal changes. They understood viscerally that nature was powerful, that humans were vulnerable, that the elements could destroy as easily as they sustained. Modern industrial society has forgotten this, imagining that technology insulates us from nature's power. Climate change and rising seas are reminding us of what the flood myths never forgot. We live on a water world, where the balance between land and sea is contingent, where climate can shift, where nature ultimately sets the boundaries within which human civilization exists. The flood myths carry wisdom born from this understanding. As you rest, breathing deeply, imagine the rising waters of today. Not mythical, but real. Not judgment, but consequence. Not divinely sent, but humanly caused. Yet the human response required is perhaps the same that the myth suggested. Awareness of danger, preparation for change, preservation of what is valuable, hope for renewal, and the wisdom to live in better balance with the natural world that sustains us. The flood myths bridge ancient and modern, connecting our ancestors' experiences of catastrophic environmental change to our own. They remind us that we are part of a long human story of survival through disaster, adaptation to change, and the resilience to continue despite loss. This is both sobering and comforting as we face our own age of environmental transformation. Let these thoughts settle gently as we move toward the conclusion of our journey. The flood myths have much to teach us still. Lessons about memory, meaning, and what it means to be human in a world where catastrophe is always possible, but survival is never guaranteed yet somehow achieved generation after generation. Part 18. The Nature of Myth and Memory. As we near the end of our exploration, let us reflect on what the flood myths teach us about how humans create meaning, preserve memory, and understand our place in the cosmos. Your breathing is slow and steady, your body completely at rest, your mind open to these final contemplations. Myth is not falsehood. This is perhaps the most important lesson from our journey through flood narratives. When we call something mythical, we often mean it is untrue, invented, fantasy. But myth is actually something deeper and more complex than simple truth or falsehood. Myths are narratives that encode meaning, preserve memory, explain the inexplicable, and connect communities to their past and to the sacred. They operate on symbolic and archetypal levels, transforming specific events into universal patterns. They compress and expand time, merge multiple events into single narratives, and attribute natural processes to supernatural agents. The flood myths are not scientifically accurate accounts of geology and climate. They do not provide reliable data about water volumes or precipitation rates. They mix metaphor with memory, symbol with history. But this does not make them false in the deeper sense. The myths preserve true things, that catastrophic floods occurred and traumatized populations, that sea levels rose and drowned ancestral lands, that human wickedness can lead to self-destruction, that survival requires preparation, virtue, and sometimes luck, that after catastrophe, renewal is possible, that we are all descendants of survivors. These truths are packaged in narrative form, with supernatural elements, moral lessons, and cultural meanings specific to each tradition. The packaging should not be confused with the content. The myths are vehicles for truth, not literal truths themselves. This understanding allows us to respect both scientific and mythological knowledge without forcing them into conflict. Science tells us what physically happened according to evidence and natural law. Myth tells us what it meant for those who experienced it, and what it means for us who remember. Both are necessary for full understanding. The remarkable consistency of flood myths worldwide suggests something profound about human psychology and culture. Why do peoples separated by oceans and millennia all create flood stories with similar elements? Several explanations are possible and likely all contribute. First, floods are universal human experiences. Every culture that lives near water experiences floods. This common experience leads to common narratives. The universality of flood myths may reflect the universality of floods themselves. Second, humans may have innate cognitive patterns that shape how we process and remember catastrophe. The narrative structure of warning, catastrophe, survival, and renewal may be built into how human minds make sense of disaster. We naturally create stories that follow this arc because it helps us process trauma and maintain hope. Third, there may be actual historical connections between flood traditions. Human populations migrated carrying stories with them. Trade routes connected distant cultures, allowing narrative exchange. The Indo-European language family, spreading from a common source, may have carried common myths that evolved into the diverse traditions we see in Greek, Indian, and Persian flood stories. Fourth, and most intriguingly, the myths may preserve actual memories of events that affected populations worldwide. The end of the Ice Age, with its rising seas and catastrophic floods, affected every inhabited continent. These events occurred within the time frame of human cultural memory. The myths may be humanity's oldest history, predating written records by thousands of years. Research on oral tradition has revealed its surprising reliability over long time spans. Aboriginal Australian traditions, for instance, have been shown to preserve accurate geographical information about coastlines and landscapes that existed over 7,000 years ago. If oral tradition can maintain accuracy that long, then flood myths could indeed preserve memories from the end of the Ice Age, 12 to 8,000 years ago. This suggests that myths should be taken seriously as historical sources, though carefully interpreted. They are not scientific reports, but they are not pure fiction either. They occupy a middle ground. Memory transformed by retelling, history shaped by meaning-making, events interpreted through cultural and religious frameworks. The flood myths also reveal something about human relationship with time. Modern Western culture tends to think of time as linear, progressive, moving from past through present to future. We focus on novelty, progress, and moving forward. We are culturally future-oriented. But many cultures represented in flood myths have cyclical or spiral concepts of time. Events repeat, ages come and go. What happened before will happen again. The flood is not a unique event but an archetypal one, something that has occurred and will occur, part of the cosmic pattern of creation and destruction. This cyclical view may actually be more realistic than the progressive linear view. Civilizations do rise and fall. Climates do shift between warm and cold periods. Sea levels have risen and fallen multiple times in Earth's history. Catastrophes recur. The flood myths, in their cyclical understanding, may be wiser than modern assumptions of endless progress. The myths also encode ethical and spiritual teachings that transcend their specific cultural contexts. The importance of righteousness, even when surrounded by wickedness. The value of heeding warnings and preparing for danger. The necessity of preserving life and knowledge through catastrophe. The possibility of renewal after loss, the importance of covenant and promise after disaster. These lessons emerge across cultures in their flood traditions. They represent accumulated human wisdom about surviving catastrophe, maintaining community, and preserving meaning through disruption. They are practical wisdom disguised as divine narrative. The role of the hero or survivor in flood myths also teaches important lessons. Noah, Utnapishtim, Manu, Deucalion, Nu-U. These figures share common traits. They listen to warnings others ignore. They act when action seems pointless. They preserve life when destruction seems total. They maintain faith or virtue when everyone else has lost both. These heroes are not warriors or conquerors. They are preservers, builders, faithful followers of instruction. The flood myths thus elevate different virtues than heroic epics. In the flood, strength and courage matter less than wisdom, obedience, foresight, and care. The hero survives not by fighting but by preparing, not by conquering but by enduring. This offers a different model of heroism relevant to our time. Facing climate change and environmental catastrophe, we need heroes who preserve, who prepare, who maintain knowledge and life through difficulty. We need ark builders more than dragon slayers. The animals preserved on the ark have symbolic significance beyond the practical. They represent the whole of creation, the diversity of life, the interconnectedness of the natural world. Noah's responsibility extends beyond human survival to encompass all living things. This is a deeply ecological vision, recognizing that human fate is bound to the fate of the natural world. In an age of mass extinction and biodiversity loss, this aspect of the flood myth takes on urgent meaning. We are responsible not just for human survival, but for preserving the richness of life itself. The Ark becomes a metaphor for conservation, for protecting endangered species, for maintaining habitats, for ensuring that future generations inherit a world as diverse and alive as the one we inherited. The covenant after the flood, particularly the rainbow covenant in the biblical tradition, establishes a new relationship between humanity and the divine. Never again will flood destroy all life. This is both promise and limit. The divine commits to preservation, but humanity must also commit to different behaviour. The covenant is mutual, establishing obligations on both sides. In secular terms, this can be understood as humanity coming to terms with its own power and responsibility. We have the capacity to damage or preserve the world. The future depends on our choices. The covenant represents maturity, the end of blaming catastrophe entirely on external forces and accepting our role in creating or preventing disaster. Your mind is very quiet now, drifting peacefully through these deep waters of meaning. The flood myths contain more wisdom than can be exhausted in one contemplation. They will continue to speak to future generations, offering their ancient wisdom to new circumstances, their eternal patterns to novel challenges. Let us move now to our final reflection, bringing together all that we have explored on this long, gentle journey through the waters of myth and memory. Conclusion: the eternal return of water. As we prepare to conclude our journey, let your body sink even deeper into relaxation. The flood myths have carried us across thousands of years, through every continent, across multiple cultures and civilizations. What have we learned from this vast exploration? We have learned that the flood narrative is perhaps the most universal story humanity tells. From Mesopotamia to the Americas, from Asia to the Pacific Islands, from ancient times to the present, humans have remembered and retold stories of catastrophic floods. This universality suggests deep truth, whether historical, psychological, or both. We have learned that these myths likely preserve memories of real events. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic environmental changes: rising seas, flooding coastlines, catastrophic outburst floods, climate disruptions. Our ancestors lived through these changes, and their stories, transformed by time and retelling, are what we call flood myths. We have learned that myths and science need not conflict but can complement each other. Science reveals the physical mechanisms: glacial melting, sea level rise, tsunami generation, climate shifts. Myth reveals the human experience: fear, loss, survival, hope, renewal. Together, they provide fuller understanding than either alone. We have learned that floods, both mythical and real, shape civilizations. They force migrations, create cultural memories, inspire religious and philosophical reflection, and remind humanity of our vulnerability. The flood is not just past, but present and future, a recurring theme in human experience. We have learned that the flood myths encode wisdom relevant to our time. They warn about the consequences of disturbing natural balance. They emphasize the importance of preparation and preservation. They teach that catastrophe, while devastating, need not be final. They show that humanity has survived before and can survive again. We have learned that oral tradition can preserve accurate information across remarkable time spans. The flood myths may be humanity's oldest continuous narratives, passing from generation to generation for 10,000 years or more. They connect us to our deepest past, to ancestors who survived catastrophes we can barely imagine. We have learned that different cultures, while telling similar stories, emphasize different values. Mesopotamian myths focus on divine caprice and the importance of divine favor. Biblical tradition emphasizes righteousness and covenant. Hindu tradition sees floods as cyclical cosmic events. Native American traditions emphasize harmony with nature and animal helpers. Each culture shapes the flood story to reflect its values and worldview. We have learned that the flood represents more than physical water. It symbolizes chaos, judgment, purification, transformation, and renewal. The flood is both ending and beginning, death and rebirth. destruction, and creation. It is the ultimate reset, the return to primordial waters from which new worlds emerge. We have learned that heroes of flood myths are preservers rather than destroyers, builders rather than warriors, those who listen rather than those who conquer. This offers a different model of heroism, one perhaps more needed in our age than traditional martial heroes. We have learned that the ark, whether boat or chest or log, represents salvation through preparation, preservation through foresight, survival through obedience to warning. It is fundamentally hopeful symbol, asserting that even facing total destruction, survival is possible for those who prepare. We have learned that animals and biodiversity matter in the flood story. The preservation of life in its diversity is central to the narrative. This ecological wisdom, ancient as it is, speaks urgently to our present crisis of mass extinction. We have learned that covenant and promise follow catastrophe. After the flood comes renewal, new beginning, divine or cosmic promise that such destruction need not repeat. This pattern of catastrophe followed by covenant offers hope that current environmental crises might lead to new understandings and commitments. We have learned that memory is longer than we imagine. What happened 10,000 years ago can still be remembered, still shape culture, still speak across the abyss of time. The flood myths are bridges connecting us to our deep past, to experiences so traumatic they survived countless generations of retelling. We have learned that drowning is not forgetting. Landscapes may be submerged, civilizations may collapse, worlds may be washed away, but memory persists. The flood myths are proof that humans remember, that we carry our past with us, that loss is transformed into narrative and preserved. We have learned that water is both life and death, sustainer and destroyer, gentle and terrible. The flood myths capture this duality, showing water as divine tool of judgment, but also as element from which new life emerges. Water washes away but also cleanses. It destroys but also renews. We have learned that rising waters are not only ancient history but contemporary reality and future threat. The flood myths, born from past catastrophe, speak to present danger. Sea levels rise today as they rose at the end of the Ice Age. Coastal populations face displacement now as ancient populations did then. The pattern repeats, and the myths provide framework for understanding what we face. We have learned that humanity is resilient. We survived the Ice Age, we survived its ending. We survived dramatic climate changes, rising seas, catastrophic floods. We adapted, migrated, persevered. Our existence testifies to our ancestors' resilience. The flood myths celebrate this survival while warning against complacency. We have learned that stories matter. The flood myths have shaped religions, inspired art, influenced culture, provided moral frameworks, and connected generations for millennia. They are living stories, continuously reinterpreted, forever relevant, endlessly meaningful. They will continue beyond our time, speaking to future humans facing their own floods, their own catastrophes, their own needs for hope and renewal. Most profoundly, we have learned that flood myths are not about the flood. They are about survival, about continuity despite disruption, about finding meaning in catastrophe, about the resilience of life and the persistence of memory, about humanity's relationship with nature, with the divine, with each other, about the eternal human journey from one world to the next, carrying forward what is precious, leaving behind what is finished, always surviving, always remembering, always hoping. The flood myths tell us who we are, survivors of catastrophes past, descendants of those who preserved life through impossible circumstances, carriers of ancient memories, tellers of old stories, builders of arks in preparation for floods we hope will not come but no might. They tell us who we can be, righteous in our generation despite surrounding wickedness, prepared despite others' complacency, preservers of life and knowledge, hopeful despite reason for despair, faithful to covenant and promise, ready for renewal after loss. They tell us what we must remember, that the world can change catastrophically, that nature is powerful and we are vulnerable, that preparation and preservation matter, that virtue and wisdom can ensure survival, that after ending comes beginning, that life persists, that memory endures, that stories connect past to future. The flood myths are humanity's longest memory, our deepest story, our most universal narrative. They emerged from real catastrophe, and they speak to real dangers we face today. They are myth and history, symbol and memory, warning and hope, ending and beginning, all at once. As you drift now towards sleep, carried on these gentle waters of story and meaning, rest in the knowledge that you are part of this ancient narrative. You are descendant of survivors, heir to those who persevered, keeper of memories that stretch back to the dawn of civilization and beyond. The waters that once rose have receded, the ark that once sailed has landed, the dove that once searched has found land, the rainbow that once appeared still arches across the sky after rain, reminding us of covenant, promise and hope. Sleep now, peaceful and safe. The ancient flood is past. The future flood may never come. And even if waters rise again, humanity has survived before and will survive again. We are the inheritors of 10,000 years of flood stories, carriers of wisdom born from catastrophe, speakers of myths that will endure as long as humans tell stories. The Great Flood, whether mythical or historical, whether single event or composite memory, whether divine judgment or natural disaster, has shaped us. Its stories flow through our cultures like rivers to the sea. Its memories surge in our collective consciousness like tides. Its lessons ripple outward across generations like waves from a stone cast long ago into still water. Rest now in these deep waters of story. Float peacefully on the current of narrative that connects all humans across all time. The flood myths have carried us through this night, and they will carry future generations through nights to come, forever telling us where we've been, who we are, and how we might survive whatever waters rise ahead. Sleep, dream, remember. The story continues, as it always has, as it always will. The waters rise and fall, the world ends and begins, life persists, memory endures, hope remains, the flood is eternal, and so is survival. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest restorative, and your waking gentle. The ancient waters have carried you safely through this night. Tomorrow you will emerge renewed, like the earth after the flood, ready for new beginnings. The journey is complete, the story is told, the waters are still. Sleep well,